Okay, dear friends, it's a great honor for me to welcome you to the second day of our conference, Conflicts, Wars in the Context of Societal Transformations, held by Kyiv Polytechnic Institute Sociology Department in collaboration with our valuable partners, including Department of Public Administration at our university, KPI, our distinguished partners from Kharkiv, Karazin University, the first and the foremost faculty of sociology at Karazin University, Kharkiv Karazin University. Our also long-time partners from Odessa, from the School of Sociology, Political Science and Psychology at the National University Odessa Legal Studies Academy. I'm also happy to welcome our friends and colleagues and partners from overseas. But before we kick off academic part, let me make an announcement, because I'm really proud, honored and humbled to deliver on behalf of Ukrainian Sociological Association an award for lifelong academic achievements and contribution to Ukrainian sociology to my distinguished colleague and I dare to say my teacher from university years, Professor Viktor Tancher. Professor Tancher's career has spanned over half a century. He was a pioneer, and he is a pioneer of sociology in Ukraine, and he was one of the few sociologists who began introducing Western concepts, Western sociological theories to Ukrainian audience, Ukrainian students and faculty, social science faculty alike, as early as 1970s. He published groundbreaking books and articles on ideas of Talcott Parsons, Elvin Goldner, Neil Smelser, Jeffrey Alexander, all household names, Anthony Giddens, all household names that have shaped the sociology in the second part of the 20th century. And these scholars have made sociology the discipline as we know it. So it's my great honor to deliver this medal of Sociological Association of Ukraine medal. It's in honor of famous Ukrainian social theorist and legal theorist Bogdan Kistiakivsky, who lived in early 20th century and who studied and then collaborated with no one else as Max Weber. Unfortunately, during Ukrainian struggles for independence, he perished when he was relatively young. So I'm really honored to deliver this medal to you, and thank you for your achievements and thank you for your contribution to our sociological community. And I'm joined by Deputy Dean of Faculty of Sociology and Law at Kyiv Polytechnic Institute, Anna Ishchenko, who's also a director of our Center for Empirical Sociology, Social Plus, and the head of our lab for conflict resolution and mediation, Ms. Lyubov Melnik. We are honored to have you, and it's a great pleasure to deliver this decoration to you as a sign of your lifelong achievements, academic and teaching achievements. Thank you for everything. And let me also give you this volume. It's these are proceedings of our last year conference. The publication of this volume was made possible by the generous support of Ukrainian Fulbright Circle, Українське Фулбрайтівське коло, an NGO, a voluntary association of Fulbright program alumni. And it wouldn't have been possible without their help. And I think the very fact that we could publish this volume attests to the resilience of Ukrainians in general and Ukrainian sociological community in particular. And we really value this support from Ukrainian Fulbright Circle, because we've been using this volume as a teaching resource. We've been distributing it among our students and colleagues. And it's both useful in terms of teaching and in terms of boosting our morale. So thank you for this support. And I'm sure that it will be an interesting read to you. And Professor Tancher has also made a very generous offer to our Department of Sociology. Professor Tancher has amassed a very substantial library of original texts by Western sociologists, again ranging from Parsons to Jeffrey Alexander and Anthony Giddens, and he's offered his vast collection of social theory books as a gift to KPI Sociology Department. We are extremely grateful to you, and again we'll be extremely honored to accept this gift and use it for our teaching and research purposes. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Just picture moment. Ms. Oksana Kazmirova, our PhD student and lecturer. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And now you can switch to our business mode. And special thanks to Professor Sokuryanska from Karazin University in Kharkiv for organizing and inspiring.
Поверніть, пожалуйста, Танчера. Поверніть його, я ж йому буду говорити перш за все.
Just a second, Professor. Віктор Володимирович, поверніться, Людмила Георгіївна ще має слово. Okay. Professor Sokuryanska will also deliver a speech.
Доброго дня, шановні учасники конференції. Рада привітати вас ще раз, уже сьогодні. Ну, у нас, як завжди, я спочатку мала виголосити рішення правління Соціологічної асоціації України, а потім вже Павло Володимирович мав вручити цю нагороду, але ж зупинити Павла Володимировича неможливо, я і не намагалася, ми знаємо його вже добре, багато років. І я хочу сказати, що дійсно от постать Віктора Володимировича Танчера, якого ми вважаємо одним із засновників соціології в Україні. Ви знаєте, що соціологія за радянських часів була репресованою наукою протягом багатьох років, і її реабілітація почалася тільки починаючи десь з середини 60-х років, коли з'являлися вже перші соціологічні групи, перші соціологічні центри, коли наші соціологи, тоді ще радянські, вже відвідували міжнародні соціологічні форуми, але це можливо було лише за умови, щоб у нашій країні була створена соціологічна асоціація. І вона була створена не тому, що так хотіли можновладці, а тому, що треба було держати обличчя перед світовою, в тому числі науковою громадськістю. І була в 58-му році створена. Але, знаєте, я не знаю, скільки сьогодні залишилося соціологів в Україні, які мають посвідчення. От сьогодні перед початком нашої конференції Віктор Володимирович показував посвідчення члена соціологічної асоціації ще СРСР з 69-го року. Тобто, ну, це просто неймовірно. І знаєте, от коли я говорю, коли ми говоримо, не тільки ми про Володимира, перепрошую, про Віктора Володимировича і його внесок у розвиток соціології в Україні, ну, я просто не знаю, з ким ще можна порівняти. Ну, хіба що ще з Ручкою, бо в них дуже багато робіт, які написані спільно. Ви знаєте, коли наші студенти вивчали, коли вони вивчають роботи, в тому числі з історії і світової соціології, і соціології в Україні, де дуже багато робіт і індивідуальних, і спільно з Анатолієм Олександровичем Ручкою, наші студенти, от як для нашого покоління були Маркс і Енгельс, так для багатьох поколінь сучасних студентів, от такими є Ручка і Танчер. І це дійсно так, бо, знаєте, от мені навіть важко уявити, щоб можна було таке зробити за дуже короткий час, щоб можна було ввести от тих людей, які почали долучатися до соціології, бо ви знаєте, що в Радянському Союзі не було ані соціологічної освіти, а соціологічна наука теж не розвивалася, бо була під забороною. І окрім марксизму, ленінізму ми нічого не знали. І тут такий прорив завдяки саме Віктору Володимировичу. Це знайомство зі світовою соціологією, це знайомство з українською соціологією, яку ми також практично не знали тоді. Да? І тому от те, що ми сьогодні вручили Віктору Володимировичу найвищу нагороду нашої асоціації, це не просто заслужено, це дійсно з урахуванням всіх тих внесків, всіх тих здобутків, які були і є у Віктора Володимировича. І у мене єдине побажання. Ви знаєте, що дуже багато зараз розсилають, особливо у часи карантину, а тепер у часи війни різних сентенцій з приводу того, коли наступає отакий пік творчого розвитку. Так от у багатьох з них написано 70-80 років – це пік розвитку творчості. І я вважаю, що це так, особливо з огляду на тих колег, які дійсно у цьому віці і ще дуже активно, дуже плідно працюють, і я сподіваюся, що так буде. Я сподіваюся на подальшу співпрацю з Віктором Володимировичем. Чекаємо його статей у наших фахових виданнях, чекаємо його виступів на наших конференціях. До речі, він дуже часто бере участь у наших конференціях соціологічних, українських і не тільки українських. Ну і головне, що можна сьогодні побажати, це здоров'я і, звичайно, того, чого ми бажаємо всі. Найскорішої перемоги і миру в нашій країні. Дуже вас любимо і шануємо, Вікторе Володимировичу.
Дякую, Людмила Георгіївна. Я хотів пригадати, в далекому 80-х, в кінці 80-х років минулого сторіччя ми з Анатолієм Олександровичем Ручкою написали статтю «От ідеології рівновесія к соціології конфліктів». Чому на російській? Тому що вона призначалась для часопису «Соціологічне ісследування», яке виходило в Москві, єдиного тоді соціологічного видання. І вона була надрукована. З тих пір я мав контакти з російськими конфліктологами, які, на жаль, з 2014 року обірвалися з відомих причин. Але ми маємо зараз конфлікт з путінською Росією. І тут якраз поле велике для аналізу, для роботи конфліктологів українських. Я хотів би побажати успіхів всім нам у цій боротьбі з ворогом і успіхів в розвитку конфліктології на Україні. Так, успіхів всім бажаю.
Чекаю від вас статтю. Читаю, вже буде друга частина продовження цієї статті, яку ви написали стільки років тому.
Дякую. Дуже дякую.
Дякую вам. Дякую. Я ще хотіла сказати два слова до наших зарубіжних колег. Я вже говорила про це, але вас вчора не було. У всякому разі, я не бачила вас на екрані, сьогодні бачу і хочу сказати, ну, по-перше, велика вдячність за те, що ви долучилися, за те, що брали участь у підготовці цієї конференції, а головне, велика вдячність, просто уклінна вдячність вашому уряду ваших країн, народу ваших країн, який здійснює сьогодні таку, ну, просто величезну і так потрібну нам і моральну, і матеріальну підтримку. Низько вклоняюся, дякую вам щиро. Павло Володимирович.
Павло Володимирович.
Okay, дякую, Людмила Георгіївна. Thank you, Professor Sakurianska. And now we can switch to our panel. Apologies for delay. But again, Professor Tancher is a figure of historic prominence when it comes to the evolution of sociology in Ukraine. Thank you. And now I'm honored to give the floor to our friend and collaborator, Dr. Luc Cooper. Luc Cooper is an associate professor at London School of Economics, and he is going to talk about domestic resources of the Ukrainian state to be used if Ukraine is to succeed without excessive reliance on external sources of assistance. I think extremely relevant issue, and it's worth and useful talking about it. So thank you, Luc, for joining us, and thanks for sharing your ideas with us.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to this conference today. Yes, as Pavlo said, I'm going to be discussing the downstream challenges and risks that the Ukrainian state and war effort faces because of its significant reliance on external resources, especially, and it will be my emphasis in this short presentation, internal financial flows from allies and international financial institutions. Before I go on to that main topic of my talk, I will say something about how I understand the current war, the war of necessity, of course, that Ukraine is fighting against Russia. I think that it's very important and I'm an international relations scholar, so it's very important to be clear at the outset around how we understand the nature of this conflict and this war and what's different about it. So I think what's notable about this war is that it's a form of warfare that has become, thankfully, relatively unusual in the 21st century. It is not a common thing for one state to invade another state and to seek sweeping territorial concessions from that state, kind of outright and open imperialist posture. But of course, wars and conflicts in the 21st century are unfortunately common, and they're very difficult to stop. But these don't have the character of conventional wars between two belligerent parties, two states. They tend to be breakdowns of political and social order, sometimes driven by external interventions in different forms, but involve a multiplicity of different actors, especially armed groups, and that those actors then have an interest in the war continuing in one way or another, usually because there's some form of political and economic logic to the violence that they're carrying out. Violence by rebel groups will sometimes emerge as a form of survival in situations of very, very low resource accumulation and economic growth. So Ukraine is not in that situation, but it nonetheless doesn't entirely exclude all of the features of those types of conflicts and wars. I'm thinking here Syria, Afghanistan, and until the total Taliban takeover, though it still has many of those features. South Sudan, Sudan war right now, conflicts between two armed groups, the Democratic Republic of Congo. There are many of these examples of what has sometimes been referred to by my LSE colleague Mary Cowdor as new wars or situations of intractable violence. In the Ukrainian case, the post 2014 invasion by Russia did have some features of these wars, especially if we think that Russia and Putin set out in some ways with an agenda that where a breakdown of Ukraine's social and political order was perhaps part of the war aim that Putin was pursuing. And of course, this involved the use of proxies inside Donetsk and Luhansk in Ukraine to try to promote this kind of political economy of violence and breakdown inside Ukraine's sovereign territory. Now, one of the things that is given Ukrainian resistance, or the thing that I think has given the Ukrainian resistance such tremendous military power in its ability to resist the Russian invasion, is the democratic, civic coming together of the nation, the cohesion that has created, especially after the full-scale Russian invasion. And that provides, I think, a really important counter-cyclical or countervailing tendency towards other breakdown dynamics. But the reason that this is sort of important, and I'm emphasizing this at the outset, is that for as long as the war retains its conventional character, it should come to an end. Conventional wars, we know from history, come to a conclusion, and that's really important. So what we want to avoid is a situation where Ukraine becomes a site of intractable conflict and breakdown, political economy of violence. And that, I think, frames some of my analysis in terms of resource mobilization for the Ukrainian state and thinking about how to capitalize on that most effectively in order to make sure that Ukraine continues to have the domestic societal resources that it requires to maintain the cohesion of its resistance, to avoid breakdown tendencies. So within that context, I've been, within that academic or theoretical context, I've been coordinating a program here at the London School of Economics, but working with a number of different academic and think tank institutions internationally too, under the banner of Peace Reps Ukraine program. We're supported and funded by the UK Foreign Office, but we're obviously academically independent. But in our role of working with the UK Foreign Office, we've been quite intensively involved in preparing for some of the discussions at the upcoming Ukraine Recovery Conference, which will take place in London next week, a major meeting of international donors and Ukraine's partners and allies to assess Ukraine's ongoing economic needs. And I was recently in Kiev, where I met Pavlo, actually, which was great, and conducted a number of different meetings and visits to different industrial sites in the in Kiev Oblast to see the challenges that the Ukraine's political economy is facing up close. And I think what we see in Ukraine at the moment is classic war economy-like dynamics, in the sense that in the course of all-out wars, markets tend to seize up and stop functioning properly due to the fundamental lack of security that exists for private sector economic activity. And that then poses the need for the state to intervene to substitute for the collapse of private sector economic demand. So if the state is successful in recalibrating the domestic economy, then wars can facilitate economic growth because the demands of fighting the war offset the collapse of private sector demand. So you'd use that war-induced demand to grow the economy under the auspices of the state, of state management. And so the expansion of the state in a war economy scenario also has to grapple with the fundamental inflationary dangers associated with a war economy. So as physical and human resources are directed on a very, very large scale to the military, and private sector productive output falls or stagnates, either because of the sheer nature of physical destruction of property, or just the risk that physical destruction of property might happen, then wars can also tend towards generating shortages that are sometimes favorable to inflation and war profiteering. So if we're thinking about what's happening in a political economy sense, when all-out wars occur, we can see that there's a simultaneous combination of a supply and demand crisis that's happening at the same time, and that supply and demand crisis will tend to intensify and become worse if the state adopts a non-interventionist policy. So in Ukraine at the moment, if we take a look at some of the data, we can see, the enormous destructive impact of the full-scale Russian invasion. The National Bank of Ukraine, of course, estimate that the unemployment rate for 2022 was something in the region of 21%. That's up from just under 10% in 2021, so doubled. Some predictions are slightly more serious than that, rising to 1 in 4 people who are looking and available for work, being unable to find it. So, they predict that it will remain very high this year. We see falling real wages. We see very, very steep inflation of about 30% last year. And of course, in the estimates for Ukraine's GDP, we have this huge contraction of something in the region of about 30%, 29 or 30%. And so we can see this simultaneous demand and supply crisis happening in the Ukrainian economy. On the demand side, private sector economic activity will remain, the environment for it will remain very volatile for some time. Even if there is a rapid end to the war in Ukraine's favor, the ongoing threat from Russia will make it quite challenging for kickstarting business investment. And that means that's placed the burden on the state to drive forward economic activity and reconstruction. So I visited a elevator manufacturer in Kiev Oblast, and they told me that 80% of its current business is with the Ukrainian government at the moment. So you see how state intervention is so important right now in keeping businesses afloat and keeping them alive in the course of this economic contraction. So at the same time, we also have a supply crisis. So businesses in some sectors are experiencing challenges with the supply of labor, even though there's very, very high unemployment. And this is, of course, due to the fact that there's massive internal and external displacement combined with military mobilization. And of course, while military mobilization is the smaller factor, it can have a disproportionate, and has had a disproportionate impact on some sectors. So when I met the construction and building materials workers union, for example, they estimated that something in the region of 1 in 4 of the 200,000 formerly employed workers in the construction sector are currently enlisted with the Ukrainian armed forces. So it's not surprising that businesses in Kiev Oblast told me that they were having challenges finding the skilled workers that they needed, partly due to the fact that they'd had to relocate in some cases from other parts of Ukraine, and they hadn't brought their workers with them. And on the other hand, many of their workers that had been previously employed with them prior to the war were now enlisted in the Ukrainian armed forces. So that poses the need for very intensive interventions by the state into supply and demand to drive forward economic growth. And I guess I would encourage the government of Ukraine to embrace this position as the coordinator of a war economy. And I want to flag here that Ukraine's dependency on external financial assistance from international partners poses a risk to the country's ability to retain sovereignty over its war aims. So the challenging economic landscape means that the Ukrainian state, and consequently, of course, the war effort to liberate Ukraine, is very heavily exposed to any decrease in international donor support. Any reduction from international donors would very likely trigger a serious balance of payments crisis. So the Bank of Ukraine, in their April 2023 update, hint at that, because they observe how with a recovery, even a modest one this year in the Ukrainian domestic economy, that's quite likely to lead to an increase in imports from overseas. And that brings further balance of payments risks for Ukraine that will have to be offset by an continued injection of international donor support. And that means that, of course, Ukraine is vulnerable to changes in global political alignments that may adversely impact those internal flows coming in. I'm thinking here, of course, the next US presidential election, where Donald Trump has made no secret of his opposition to giving Ukraine, continuing to provide Ukraine with military and economic aid. And that would pose huge challenges to Ukraine's, the viability of Ukraine's war effort. And so that means, I think it's really in Ukraine's interest to maximize the resources that the state is getting from the domestic Ukrainian economy. And I think there are two key priorities going forward that I would suggest. The first is using measures to maximize Ukraine's productive economy, and in particular, adopting measures that support directly Ukrainian industry and Ukrainian producers. And I'll say something about that in a moment. And then secondly, the other priority is to really look at how taxation revenue can be significantly increased to really secure the state's long-term position. So in the run into the Ukraine Recovery Conference next week, there's lots of discussions over international private sector engagement in Ukraine's recovery, and so international businesses and so on. And I think what I'm trying to say in these discussions is that it's really important to be realistic about what kind of international firms have a business case right now for orientating to the Ukrainian market. So given that Ukraine was not a big recipient country for foreign direct investment prior to the full-scale Russian invasion of 2022, and that the security environment, despite Ukrainian progress on the battlefield, remains pretty obviously very unfavorable to foreign direct investment, then it means that the firms that are orientating to reconstruction will tend to be selling services and goods into the Ukrainian market in one way or another. And that brings a danger for Ukraine's domestic economy, because it is simply the case that Ukrainian companies cannot compete for contracts on a level playing field with international competitors at the moment, for the very obvious reasons that they are not operating in peacetime conditions where their international competitors are. And I think it's really important for the government of Ukraine to be clear-sighted about that and resolutely prioritize their domestic productive economy in the reconstruction process. I think it's vital to avoid a situation where, as domestic production struggles, external debt obligations are racked up or increasing, only for that money to then be deposited overseas through increased imports, effectively supporting jobs overseas rather than in the domestic Ukrainian market, where they're so powerfully and so clearly needed. And so I think what Ukraine would be wise to do is adopt something similar to what the Biden administration calls the Buy American policy, a kind of Buy Ukrainian policy, where you give specific advantage to domestic manufacturers and construction firms in infrastructure and procurement contracts that the state is pursuing. And then the second area that I think could be priority for Ukraine is, of course, the question of tax mobilization. And that represents a key vulnerability to Ukraine's economic political security. So in the 2023 budget, taxation is expected to account for just 38% of expenditure. And so that illustrates Ukraine's dependency on its allies and international financial institutions. There hasn't been a discussion, I don't think, of wealth taxes in Ukraine that might raise additional revenue. Linking tax rates progressively to income often tends to be taboo in public discussion too. And of course, that reflects the long-term problems of corruption in the Ukrainian state, and just as importantly, the perception of it among citizens. So there's also challenges when it comes to getting taxation revenue in. Of course, there's the grey economy, the informal economy. There's a system of informal negotiation between tax collectors and firms, and often systemic evasion are common problems when it comes to the collection of business and workplace taxes. So what I want to end on by saying is that when it comes to tax mobilization, social and labor policy are really closely connected with tax revenue. The state's debt sustainability, and ultimately, in Ukraine's case, its sovereignty over its war aims. And so the job that Ukraine has ahead is to look at two, I think, areas which could be effective to increasing taxation mobilization. The first is building quasi-voluntary compliance among citizens. And so this is something that's been found to be really important in lower and middle income countries when it comes to increasing tax revenue, that you really persuade citizens that they're contributing to the provision of public goods. And in Ukrainians' case, the public good is very obvious. It's, of course, securing victory in the war, protecting democratic institutions, and supporting the well-being of citizens. So support for the war effort provides a chance to break this vicious cycle of low taxes, low faith in public authority, and weak state capacity. And given that taxation revenues fell by less than half the rate of GDP in 2022, there may be signs that this is happening, that support for the war effort is really encouraging Ukrainians to pay their taxes on an unprecedented level, knowing that that's going directly to support the Ukrainian armed forces. And then, of course, the second level where it needs to be cleaned up, and there's mechanisms that can be used from international best practice research, and that's when it comes to enforcement. So those two tracks, voluntary, quasi-voluntary compliance combined with enforcement, can be really effective in generating increased taxation revenue. But I would also think, and add to that picture too, that there would be scope to increase taxes to ensure that the burden of fighting the war of national liberation falls most on the shoulders of those that can afford to pay that burden. Thank you very much for the invitation to talk to you today, and I'm really looking forward to hear your questions and comments.
Thanks, Luke, for extremely interesting talk, and it's inspiring, and it begs a lot of questions. I have myself been pontificating, professing about the importance of the developmental state and the critical role of state in enhancing, promoting developmental agenda and modernization in general. But I think we both come up with arguments which suffer from being prescriptive rather than analytical. Because we say, and well, this whole tradition, intellectual tradition behind the idea of developmental state said, well, you got to be capable, you got to be effective, you got to be autonomous. At the same time, you have to have effective channels of communication with significant segments of the society. How can it be pulled off? How can it be delivered, given that we are in a morass of corruption, state ineptitude, and quite active society, but society, well, society is going through mood swings, and prior to the war, the levels of trust to state institutions, political institutions, were extremely low, one of the lowest, if not the lowest, on the global scale. Things have changed, but I think kind of the major rationale behind this was the realization on the part of the population at large that Ukrainian society has to be a projection of strength and confidence and solidarity to make sure that we succeed in this existential battle with Russia, with Russian aggression. So, being more specific, for example, one of your prescriptions was that we should follow Biden's administration policy by American, but does Ukraine possess economic, political, global leverage on a par with the United States to effectively implement such policies, given WTO regulations, given the EU regulations and requirements towards Ukraine? Do you think it could be renegotiated in favor of Ukraine? Because let me give you just one example. A couple of years ago, there were very heated debates in Ukraine because Ukrainian government banned the export of timber to the European Union, hoping that it would boost domestic furniture production, production of goods with added value, and the European Union was extremely and vocally critical of this policy change. So what would be your prescription again to pull off these policies, to actually implement them? Because again, as far as experience of East Asian tigers show us, they did combine domestic state capacity, reliance on their resources, kind of national mobilization, but at the same time, they were given a leg up by the U.S. government because of the Korean War, because of the Vietnam War, and they were given access to the biggest domestic market in the world, that is American domestic market. So can Ukraine be given such preferences, or can Ukraine negotiate such preferences for itself? Do you think these are kind of feasible goals given kind of geopolitical, geoeconomic constellations for the time being? Thank you. And again, thanks for your fantastic presentation. It's extremely thought-provoking, and thanks for joining us, and thanks for supporting us, because this conference is it's not just about academic debate, it's about making impact, and it's about boosting our morale and strengthening our resilience. So we are extremely grateful to you for this.
Yeah, thank you very much for those comments. I think that they fall into two tracks. One track is around this question around tax revenue mobilization and domestic state capacity, and because citizens have low faith in public authority, or at least did until the full-scale Russian invasion, as Pavlo said, then they become very reluctant to pay their taxes, because they can see that those taxes are not contributing to the construction of public goods. So how do you break that cycle? And I think, Pavlo, I think in some ways you answered both of those points. The second, your second point was also around these geopolitical conditions in international political economy, and whether it's plausible that Ukraine would be able to implement preferential policy towards domestic producers in the course of construction. And yes, so I think in both cases, you of course went some way to answering that question yourself, but I'm glad to add something. So I think that in the question of taxation and support for public authority and popular quasi-voluntary compliance with tax authorities, I think the war does create what you might call a moment of opportunity, a moment of transformation, when you see the extraordinary support for the Ukrainian armed forces across the whole of the population, and that the way Ukraine has come together through and has these deeply embedded civic networks that, of course, are contributing and mobilizing tremendous resources themselves that are then going in to the war effort. So the question is how those civic networks and civic mobilizations, what kind of role can they play to scrutinize and clean up the state, so as that they are actually supporting state reforms that contribute to a public infrastructure that is transparent, that is able to protect citizens and able to provide public infrastructure and social infrastructure, and of course, most importantly, continue to prosecute the war. So I think in addition to what you said, I think there's also an argument here, and I think this maybe points to an updating of the developmental state question, the developmental state canon, in what kind of role do civic networks and civil society play within the development state picture to give citizens the belief and faith that institutions are working in their interests. So I think that's part of the answer, or one way of approaching the answer. Your second point is whether a buy-Ukrainian policy would meet with opposition from major geopolitical players and international financial institutions if Ukraine adopted such a preferential policy. So I think your example of the classic example of the East Asian tigers and the way in which geopolitical security shaped the terms of its integration into international trading system is of course part of the answer, because Ukraine is very well placed to make a very similar argument. And indeed, in terms of European and Western security, it is already making that argument, i.e., we are on the front lines defending Europe against Russian imperialism. So it's already putting forward that security rationale for its economic and military support. So I think that's part of the answer. On a more lower order level, I mean, I've had quite a few discussions with individuals within the international financial institutions, with the European Commission, and I don't sense that there is tremendous opposition to Ukraine adopting a preferential policy for its domestic producers. And in fact, in some instances, there is support for it. I think the Biden administration and the US government, it fits very well with their arguments. The European Union, partly because of its concerns about some of the more protectionist elements of the Biden administration policy, are not going to be natural supporters of such a move inside Ukraine, but I think they can be persuaded on security grounds. And of course, they're the most important trading partner for Ukraine right now. And it's not the whole, I think you're absolutely right, and this is just the last point I'll raise. It's not just, I'm not advocating autarky here. That's not what the developmental state conception is. So Ukraine will continue to need that association agreement with the European Union, will be a vital part of its political economic development going forward. But it's not just about the domestic picture, but it's about maximizing the revenue generated from the domestic economy to support the state as much as possible. And also making sure that Ukraine is aligning with European rules that allow it to capitalize on the access to the European market that it has under the association agreement. So taking forward that process of alignment with European regulations will be really important for exporters, especially those in added value areas, as you rightly emphasized.
Thank you, Luke. Thanks. And we can move on. I'm happy to give the floor to our longtime friend and partner, Professor Довіле Будрита, representing two countries, two nations, and combining in her research different experiences and different approaches. And all of these strands are extremely thought-provoking and competent and useful for bettering our understanding of the world around us. Thank you, Довіле.
Thank you so much, Pavlo. My best wishes from Vilnius, Lithuania. Right now I'm in Vilnius, Lithuania, and I thought for my brief presentation, I will kind of synthesize the insights from many talks and many writings that we have heard from the Baltic community about Ukraine. So Pavlo himself was part of one of our webinars of Association for the Advancement of Baltic Studies, where we talked about Ukraine, and we will also meet in Kaunas in just several days on Thursday, where Ukraine will be one of the major topics for discussion. So the community of Baltic scholars cares about Ukraine a whole lot, and I think there's a lot of interesting work which is being done, again, focusing on what's happening with Ukraine. I'm going to try to share my PowerPoint. I don't know whether it's possible to do that. If not, I can talk without it.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. I have some pictures to show that I would like to show. And let's see here. Let's shoot. 1 second, I'll try one more time so that I can show the full screen. All right, I think I can. Right, here we go. The topic of my presentation would be about decolonization, and I'm using the term a decolonizing moment. It's more like a decolonizing period, Lithuania's vicarious identification with Ukraine since 2013-2014. And my presentation is an attempt to try to capture all of these changes in identities, new discourses that we see in Lithuania, but we also see in the broader region of Central Eastern Europe since, I would argue, 2013-2014, but definitely also that became very visible with this war. Let me see, for some reason I can't move the slides. Let me try one more time. Okay. So I'm drawing very much, as I said, on the work by the Baltic scholars, and also in particular by Maria Malkso. I think one of the best works that was written about East and Central Europe as such, and the Baltic states, including the Baltic states, is her article in the Journal of Genocide Studies that was published in 2022, which was called The Postcolonial Moment in Russia's War Against Ukraine. And I think what matters is to capture very much the dynamic, the most prevalent dynamic in this war. And in the words of Maria Malkso, this was the incompatible logics of sovereignty, Ukraine sovereignty, desire to maintain sovereignty, and imperialism, right? And I think it matters to repeat again and again that this is an imperial war. Identities, memories play a major role in this war. This is not about NATO's expansion, as some of the colleagues of mine often like to repeat in the West, that it's about the desire of Ukraine, and not just Ukraine, but also the entire Central Eastern Europe, to assert subjectivities, to remain independent, to maintain sovereignty, right? And very often the writers who write about decolonization associated with the war are criticized for not defining what they mean by decolonization. And again, drawing on the work of Baltic scholars, drawing on the work of Maria Malkso, I think that there are two possible meanings associated with decolonization when it comes to this war. And number one, it would be very simply resisting Russia, getting rid of Russian influence. In the case of Lithuania, the Baltic states, I will talk about the ways in which the war is waged at home. And number two, once again, it would be about the assertion of subjectivities, of assertion of countries such as Lithuania, internationally, and also definitely in the European institutions, and making its voice heard, right? And I think thinking about the processes of decolonization in the context of the war definitely helps to decolonize the thinking pattern about our region, about Central Eastern Europe, because very often in the discussions of the war, we still see focus on the major powers, on Russia, and very often the voices of the region is still forgotten. So I think that's one point to be made, that by thinking about the ways in which war is fought by the countries such as Lithuania, we also help to decolonize thinking pattern about Eastern Europe that's still very much prevalent in many disciplines, including my own. So in my brief presentation, I'd like to address several points. In fact, 3 points. I'd like to argue that the concept of vicarious identification is very relevant to the Lithuanian case, and it helps us to understand the discourses and identities that we see being asserted in Lithuania, going back to 2013, but especially clearly since the outbreak of the war in 2022, the full-scale war in 2022. I will briefly talk about the reasons behind what I call vicarious identification. And very briefly, vicarious identification would be the adoption of Ukraine's war, establishing a collective identity with Ukraine, fighting Ukraine's war at home. Not all countries in East and Central Europe, again, fully support Ukraine, unfortunately. I mean, countries that come to mind would be countries like Hungary that continue to oppose the attempts of countries such as Lithuania to fully support Ukraine. There are other countries like Serbia, in which, again, still quite a few people still associate themselves with Russia, right? So why vicarious identification in countries such as Lithuania and the other 2 Baltic states? And I will conclude by trying to propose some very preliminary insights about the major implications of the current identity shifts that we see in the Baltic states, but also in the broader Central Eastern Europe for European politics and even global politics, because again, I think that some major transformations are taking place that will have a big impact. So very briefly, theoretically, I keep thinking about what I see in Lithuania, what especially was very, very visible since the outbreak of full-scale war in 2022, this very emotional reaction by many people when they heard about the outbreak of war. Very often phrases such as "we're all in the front lines now" were used. People felt that we could be next, the war could come to their homes next. And I think that to capture this very emotional identification that many people still feel about Ukraine, but not just people, but especially I think that there's shared identity developing on the state level, I think that the concept of vicarious identification could be an appropriate concept to use. It's rooted in psychology. And in psychology, it means that individuals adopt identities and stories as their own, making them a part of their lives. But what I will argue together with Christopher Browning, Perry Yonemi, and Brent Steele is that this concept could be also applied to international relations, not just individuals, but also states and societies, right? So when talking about the concept of vicarious identification, the story of Rachel Dolezal comes to mind. It's a well-known story, at least in the United States. She was a Caucasian woman, a white woman, and she has experienced abuse in her childhood, and at some point in her life, she asserted her identity as an African American, and she started to be very active in African American community, and she asserted that she was an African American. And it was a huge scandal when her parents outed her and said, well, by the way, she's not an African American, she's actually white, pretending to be an African American. So in the United States, her story basically raised many questions about why do individuals want to adopt somebody else's identity? Why do they want to adopt other stories as their own, making them part of their lives, right? And who has the right to do so? So a very good book by Christopher Browning and others actually argues that sometimes in international relations, we see states establishing collective identities. So states adopting identities and stories of others as their own, and creating this a very emotional sense of we-ness, that we are one. And why this is happening sometimes in international relations, the main goal is to produce security and stability, and previous traumas, collected memory plays a major role when this is happening. So my argument is that in the case of Lithuania, I definitely see the strong vicarious identification with Ukraine. And my argument is also that the previous experiences of memories, traumatic memories, and the ways in which they're mobilized explain why this is happening, right? So I think the story of support for Ukraine from the Baltic states is very well known. I will not repeat it. I'll just say that since 2013, 2014, in the case of Lithuania, Lithuania was in that time, in 2013, 2014, the only European Union country that sent lethal aid to Ukraine. When the war broke out in 2022, there were many calls, both in Lithuania, but also in diaspora, to establish a no-fly zone. So the Baltic states, Lithuania, in a sense, took a very, what we could call a hawkish position and sent quite a lot of military aid, javelins, anti-tank missiles, Stinger anti-aircraft missiles to Ukraine. There has been political support calling Russia a terrorist state, and also the Baltic states, including Lithuania, relatively early in the outbreak of the war, used the term genocide to refer to this genocidal war, which is happening. Unlike the previous refugee crisis from Belarus, in 2021, right, when many Lithuanians were not friendly towards refugees at all, this is not the case with Ukrainian refugees. Many people, I know many people in my own family, adopted Ukrainian refugees into their homes and adopted them into the society. So this was, again, for Lithuania, which is not known for being friendly towards refugees. That was quite an important development. I have some pictures, images like these. We are not uncommon at all, especially in 2022, but it's still happening when Ukraine's flag was adopted as Lithuania's own flag. Gender dimension is important. There were very emotional protests against rape in Ukraine in front of the Russian embassy in the 3 Baltic states. And if we look at some numbers, right, we see that the Baltic states are one of the most generous donors when it comes to bilateral aid towards Ukraine. It's above 0.75% of GDP, right? So this is nothing new to say that indeed the Baltic states have tried to do a lot to support Ukraine. But my argument is that what we are seeing right now in the Baltic states, in particular in the case of Lithuania that I focus on, we're seeing more than just support. We're seeing a fundamental transformation of identity that's still continuing, right? So it could be seen empirically looking at opinion polls. There are social measurements of society, and Ukraine is seen as the most liked country, with more than 78% of Lithuanians giving positive evaluation of Ukraine. If we look at the speeches and statements of the leading politicians, we see Ukraine being linked to freedom, justice, democracy, common assertions that your war is also our war, and assertions of we-ness, assertions that we are one with Ukraine, and also amazing expressions of identification by populists, even, again, in money, for example. And in the words of Prime Minister, I would like to quote Estonian Prime Minister, this is in Estonia, that images with Ukraine became part of euro coins. This is also true about Lithuania, but Kalle said that, because we have Ukraine in our money, this is daily reminder of Ukraine's fight for freedom and its future in the European Union, right? This is an image from social media, but you see that, again, I see this every day here in Vilnius, that not only government institutions, but also businesses, schools, every day people adopted the flag of Ukraine as their form of identification, right? So this vicarious identification is not just at the state level where you see the flags of Ukraine next to Lithuania's flag all the time, but also in everyday life of people. There's this very emotional identification with Ukraine, adopting Ukraine's story, adopting Ukraine's identity, which is amazing. And also we see quite importantly the use of history in these processes of identification. This is the image from Lithuanian media, where we see images from 2022-23, where Lithuania stands with Ukraine, and images from 1991, when Ukrainians came to support Lithuania's independence, right? So very much with the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, Lithuanians remembered their own fight for sovereignty in 1991, when the tanks were sent by Gorbachev to Vilnius, right? So the argument, I will very briefly mention it, theoretically would be that the reason why we see this vicarious identification between Lithuania and Ukraine it's because the Baltic states, including Lithuania and Ukraine, since especially 2013, 2014, in the case of Ukraine, created very similar memory regimes. And in both cases, we see very strong collective trauma narratives identified with genocide, which is identified with the Soviet Union. And the link constantly is established between the so-called Soviet genocide and current genocidal war. And we also see in both cases, especially Lithuania and Ukraine, a very big role of anti-Soviet resistance fighters. In Lithuania, this discourse became very strong after 2013, 2014 in particular. And in the words of memory scholars of Barbara Tornquist-Pleva and Yurchuk, that in both cases we see this anti-colonial nationalist politics of memory, right? When remembering the former Soviet Union, we talk about genocide, we talk about fierce resistance, and those memories kind of almost reemerge and repeat themselves today, right? So again, this strong vicarious identification would not be possible if there would be no memory politics, and in a sense, those memory regimes, as I call them, definitely kind of crystallized in similar forms in Ukraine and Lithuania, especially after 2013, 2014. Related to vicarious identification, we see very important identity-related developments in the Baltic states, and I think we see some of the similar things going on in Ukraine. And there's a very strong push against everything Russian. So there are policy proposals to get rid of Russian language instruction in schools, universities, public spaces. Some people feel a strong desire to turn away from Russian culture, including literature. There's also a push to rename places with current names. So in Lithuania, for example, the theater, which was known as the Russian Theater, was renamed to be called just Vilnius Theater. The schools that have names of people such as Pushkin were also renamed, right? So indeed, there's a very strong push to get rid of that influence. And there's also definitely a major change in memory landscape. These are the images that you see in Lithuania, but also the other two Baltic states. All of the monuments associated with the so-called Great Patriotic War are being removed. And this is probably one of the better known cases. There was this huge monument in Lithuanian capital city of Vilnius associated with World War II that was also removed. And unfortunately, perhaps we saw that the removal of these monuments was associated with some debates about ethnic relations in the Baltic states, because in all three countries, in Lithuania less so, there are still significant numbers of Russian speakers, and in Lithuania, one of the social opinion surveys suggested that actually more Lithuanians would not want to rent to Russian speakers, right? So there are also, looks like this, at least preliminary investigation suggests that this kind of translated into ethnic tensions as well, right? So let me conclude by proposing some of the very preliminary insights about the impact for European and global identities of this vicarious identification that we saw. And I think that especially right now, as NATO summit in Vilnius, which will be held in July, is coming up, unfortunately, we're still seeing some divisions between the so-called new and old Europe that go back to 2003 when the United States invaded Iraq, and all of the countries in East and Central Europe associated themselves with the United States, and France and Germany positions themselves against this invasion, right? So I think we still, unfortunately, see some divisions within Europe when, especially when it comes to the discussions of Ukraine's future membership in NATO. I think definitely it's very, very clear that because of vicarious identification, Lithuania, the other two Baltic states, Poland, are much more enthusiastic about full integration of Ukraine into the transatlantic community, about punishing Russia after the war is over, while I think there are different visions of this in the so-called Western Europe, right? But nevertheless, I would say that it's still important to maintain European and transatlantic unity. And despite some of these disagreements, I think the war in Ukraine helped, especially many other countries that were very critical of nervous bolts in the past, to start seeing Russia as a threat. And indeed, at least as the war continued, we saw again that there was quite a high level of transatlantic unity in opposition to Russia, right? I think, unfortunately, we still see some global lines of division, with the so-called global South not being fully on the side of vicarious identification with Ukraine, right? But nevertheless, I think if we're thinking about the future, perhaps there's some opportunities to use the history of colonialism as a uniting thread, right? To especially, again, it might be a very, very optimistic thinking on my part, but again, I think for countries such as Lithuania, talking about colonial legacy of Russia, talking about this war as a colonial war, perhaps can establish some understanding that countries in this part of the world also have a history of painful colonialism that many countries in the global South have. So let me conclude by pointing to three ideas. I think that when it comes to this decolonizing moment of sorts that Maria Malksu was talking about, I think that we can definitely talk about the assertion of agency of countries such as Lithuania. They definitely empowered themselves. They are much more visible actors, especially in the European landscape. I think that for domestic politics, domestic identities in Lithuania, we definitely see a huge impact on vicarious identification with Ukraine. And even though it's not absolute, right, there are people who are opposing this. But nevertheless, we see a very clear connection between vicarious identification and the processes of decolonization and decommunization, condemnation of the Soviet past that we are seeing in Lithuania. And last but not least, I think that a very strong Ukrainian resistance that we have been seeing definitely helped to challenge this portrayal of East and Central Europe as weak actors in international relations. And I think that newly found assertiveness by actors in East and Central Europe, including Lithuania, definitely helps us to show that this previous periphery, right, in international relations is actually essential for what happens in the future in our region and even globally. So I'll stop right here, and thank you so much for your attention, and thank you so much for letting me share these ideas.
Thank you, Davile, for brilliant presentation, and thank you for standing with Ukraine and for your solidarity and solidarity exhibited by two nations you proudly represent, Lithuania and the United States. It's so great, and you are great inspiration for us intellectually and morally. I could not have been more thankful to you than I am now. And we really cherish our friendship and our cooperation and your long-time participation in our events. And we are looking forward to more, because we are hoping to gear up. We are launching new master's program in social data analysis, in addition to our existing undergraduate and graduate programs in conflict resolution and mediation. So we are in full swing, and not least thanks to your support and inspiration. So extremely grateful to you.
Let me just say that the feelings are definitely mutual, and I feel definitely very honored to be part of this event, and definitely value very much friendship with Ukraine on many different levels. I mean, as I said, I think it's more than friendship. I think it goes towards identification, vicarious identification. So
thank you. Thank you. Extremely grateful to you for all these things. And kind of little note, technical note, but I think devil is in details. So this stream is going to be saved on our channel. So using this link, you will be able, everyone in fact will be able to access our session, and we are using it as an educational resource with our students. So it would be great if you could disseminate this video, these talks among your colleagues and the students, because I think they are great teaching and in fact research resource, because you guys have been pushing boundaries of the scholarship. And again, it's both useful and inspirational. Thank you.
thank you.
Okay, let us move on. Jessica. Oh, hi,
Hello,
Jessica.
hello, everybody. Thank you for having me.
Hey.
It's a pleasure and an
Thank
honor.
you. Thank you.
Good
and
to be here.
And let me thank you, and not just you, but a Fulbright program in Ukraine. And Ukrainian Fulbright Circle, українське Фулбрайтівське коло. Thanks to support of these organizations, we were able to hold the conference last June, and Ukrainian Fulbright Circle generously funded the publication of conference proceedings. And now we are proud to present last year manual, and this conference is some kind of tribute to last year conference, because the conversation we began last year, and with the same core group of scholars is being continued this summer. And we lived through a challenging winter of our discontent, but literally winter of our discontent made glorious summer by sons and daughters of Ukraine fighting in armed forces, but also by international support, by international solidarity and support from Fulbright program in Ukraine, from Institute of International Education, from Ukrainian Fulbright Circle, українське Фулбрайтівське коло. They have been critical and indispensable part of boosting of our morale, of keeping our spirits high. So again, hopefully, continuing that Shakespeare's quote, hopefully our bruised arms will be hung up for monuments soon, when Ukraine prevails on the battlefield and defends its mortal foe, which is Russia now. So thank you, Jessica, and thank you to the community, Fulbright community, and Fulbright institutions you represent. We cherish your friendship, we cherish your contribution, we cherish your support, and we cherish our cooperation. Again, we would not have been here without this support and solidarity.
Absolutely, it's an honor. And I should also mention that through Institute of International Education, which is also our office, so IIE, based in New York, large and very old NGO in America, started in 1917, actually, in the context of the Bolshevik Revolution, to support scholars and get also artists like Marc Chagall out of the situation of the revolution for a time. And we have been raising funds and providing scholarships to universities and students throughout Ukraine, inside Ukraine, and we continue to do that. So we're always looking for innovative new projects, new partners. We have, I think, a lot of rebuilding that we're doing and continue to do so. It's only the beginning of novi etap of what our office can do in Ukraine. Yes, so I'll also want to mention that Fulbright is open for applications from Ukrainian citizens through our office. So you can apply through us if you are a Ukrainian citizen. And you don't have to be living only in Ukraine. You can apply if you are displaced in another country. The only exception is if you are displaced to the United States, then you cannot apply. You would be ineligible. But anywhere else in the world, if you are displaced because of the war, you can still apply for our programs. So everything is open still, and we look forward to reading your applications and hopefully engaging with you in interviews. So that's our latest news. We also have a photography exhibit, War and Resistance, featuring 7 photographers from the United States and from Ukraine who are working in Ukraine, mostly in the front lines, but also in other contexts away from the front. Their photographs are featured in New York Times, CNN, all over the world. And we have displayed this exhibit now in 10 different cities in America and Europe. Right now it's in Berlin, and it's going to continue to travel. And through that exhibit, we have also partnered with humanitarian aid NGOs to raise money for Ukraine. And we would love to work with any of you to bring that exhibit to your city or to your institution as well. So keep in touch with us. But today I'm going to talk a little bit more as a scholar rather than a director. I have recently published an anthology, and this builds a little bit on my research in my monograph, but it is an anthology of scholars from Ukraine and also Poland and Belarus. And what this anthology is doing is looking at recent history, the last 10 years, even 20 years, and exploring concepts of freedom, concepts of human rights through the lens of women's experiences, and women's rights in particular being very important to the last 3 years in Belarus and Poland, especially with the massive marches, which in both countries became somewhat aligned with the opposition to Lukashenko and the PIS government. So we in that anthology, me and the 14 other authors, so it's 15 of us total, we all have deep experience, at least 20 years, living and working in these three countries. If not, we are from these countries. So there are here also 3 women from Minsk, who 2 of them cannot return to Minsk. One is a curator who curated a large exhibit, the largest exhibit of Belarusian contemporary art outside of Belarus, which took place in Kyiv in 2021 in May. And this was more than art, because it included about 300 different items that historians would consider artifacts, letters, other kinds of documents of the experience of the protesters and the marchers. Many of these letters and other documents, drawings, were made in prison by women who were imprisoned in Minsk in 2021. And the state, the Ukraine government, supported this exhibit at Mistetsky Arsenal, huge museum in Kyiv. And it was really a landmark for this Belarusian movement. Now, so we started working on our anthology in 2018. We kept working on it. Now, the situation has changed on the political levels, but there are also some core concepts that we've been looking at in phase 1 of the war since 2014 that I think are valuable to revisit and understand in Ukraine in terms of the prehistory to what's happening in the war right now, not on a military level, but on a civic level. So the title of my presentation is Culture and War, Women's Activism, Human Rights and Intellectual Sovereignty in Ukraine. Intellectual sovereignty is the real concept we're working with in my anthology, and intellectuals not always being considered valuable or maybe relevant to realpolitik or geopolitics makes our analysis complicated, but also is important, I think, because culture, we know, is also a front in any war situation. The famous quote from World War II that is often attributed to Joseph Goebbels or Heinrich Himmler, "When I hear the word culture, I reach for my gun," is very much an epitomization of how culture becomes manipulated in propaganda. Much later, Henry Miller, the American playwright, revised that same quote, and he wrote, "When I hear the word culture, I reach for my gun." Remember that quote. So too, when I hear the word genius. So what Miller is saying here is genius is also a threat. And sovereignty of the subaltern in writing by Zayla Ben-Habib and others who work on the idea of post-colonialism, genius or true invention is also a threat to a regime like Russia that would like to erase a culture, erase a society. This is not to say that unique position or that genius needs to be categorized into a neat and clean national identity that has boundaries between Russia and Poland and Ukraine and Belarus, but it's a recognition of an opposition. It's a recognition of everything that the Ruski Mir is not. So in looking at culture and cultural production in Ukraine before the war, you can see some patterns that I'm going to turn to and talk about that link up with values in the messages and the themes that artists and writers were working with in relation to legal changes that were happening on the legislative level in Ukraine around women's rights, anti-discrimination laws, and national human rights strategy. So you can trace a lot of these legal changes that people are advocating for in the cultural production in society. So why is this important? Why think about women's rights in a time of war? Sometimes people say that should happen later when we have figured out human rights. But actually these two develop concurrently. And there were some things that women and gender activists had won in Ukraine, some advances, before the National Human Rights Strategy in Ukraine was ever introduced, because it was introduced in 2021. So some of this cannot be separated out one from the other, that when people are activating sort of identities in order to make claims for changes in society, these are mutually informing to other activists who are also maybe activating their identities. So there's a lot of also partnership and alliance between disability rights communities in Kyiv and women's rights communities, LGBTQ communities. Something that has been very troubling and unfair in the last 20 years is the attribution or the mapping of women's rights onto a left-right political spectrum. Actually, women's rights do not align with a leftist position. They are on both sides. And to better understand the evolution of even international approaches and human rights from the UN, it's really critical not to give, I think, too much weight to a left or right political spectrum, but to really look locally on how that spectrum plays out and not make it the number one category of analysis. So in this case, the advancement of rule of law at the intersection of human rights and gender in Ukraine has and is essential for stabilizing the country, not only to protect diversity of citizenry, which is multi-ethnic, multilingual, but in rebuilding international relations, because a lot of women and women scholars in Ukraine have been doing important work as delegates to international forums for women in particular, such as UN Women has a very active presence in Ukraine. My colleague Tamara Martsenyuk from Kyiv Mohyla has done quite a bit interacting with them and informing them about women veterans and active women military personnel in Ukraine's army, because for the last now 10 years of the war, this has been a central point at which the women's movement has coalesced in Ukraine. And again, it's not a left or right position, which makes it even more powerful, because it's all sides of the political spectrum thinking about human rights of women veterans. If you're interested in learning more about that, you can check out the project Nevidimi Battalion, Invisible Battalion, and there's some great resources there for researchers on these questions. So a lot of what has been changing in civic society in Ukraine during the war since 2014 can provide some lessons during the war now that are usually relevant, but not always, because some things have changed. A place to create blueprints and models for engaging local communities in sustainable ways that will help transformation out of conflict and create also leadership and self-governance in Ukraine in the rebuilding, so that it's coming from Ukrainians, led by Ukrainians, not by external international bodies only, that there's a true partnership at work. And the strong women of Ukraine have shown fantastic models for leadership. And I will now turn a little bit to some of the history of anti-discrimination policy. Anti-discrimination policy being a little bit different than particularly women's rights and gender-based laws, which are also a little bit different than national human rights strategies. So these three categories have shaped quite a bit of civic activism and can be also wonderful foundations for the rebuilding of civic society in Ukraine. So in phase one of the war, 2014 to 2021, women's and LGBTQ movements continued to grow. Actually, across the country, they were growing, not shrinking during the war. The marches in Kyiv were also growing exponentially. They went from approximately 3,000, 4,000 in 2014 at the beginning of the war to over 10,000 marchers in 2021, with increased international support, including non-official present marchers from embassies in unofficial capacities, and huge police presence and police support in Ukraine for the safety of the marchers. Also, March 8th, Women's March in Kyiv expanded as well during these years, going from almost half a dozen participants in 2010 to 3,000 by 2015 at the outset of the war. Several studies have documented these changes. You can look up work by Oksana Kis, Martsynyuk, Olha Plachotnik, Maria Mayerchik, myself as well. Gains for gender equality included signing of gender equality law that prohibited gender discrimination, which was actually adopted in 2005, and then a more general anti-discrimination law that was adopted in 2012 and amended in 2014. The provisions for anti-discrimination were a key point of negotiation in the extended Ukraine, which was part of what sparked the Maidan revolution of 2013-2014, which Yanukovych, he refused, then President Viktor Yanukovych refused to sign that association agreement. But in that process, not only was he just refusing the general association agreement, he had also struck out the anti-discrimination law. So before he even refused to sign the whole thing, he had already gotten the EU to actually agree, the EU agreed they would strike out of the requirements this anti-discrimination law. And this created protests by gender activists who really were watching that situation very closely, and was important to have that law in the overall association agreement. So somewhat, this lowered the threshold for civilian and human rights discourse, but very temporarily, because it was then after the Maidan Revolution of Dignity in 2016, when the whole agreement was being revisited and the situation being reanalyzed from a civic perspective, from a domestic legal perspective in Ukraine, that the law, the anti-discrimination law, was signed again in 2016. So it was a win for the Revolution of Dignity, for those revolutionaries participating in it who were women activists, women and LGBTQ activists. It's very important for them, and possibly many others who could be discriminated against. Not only women and LGBTQ people experience discrimination. Of course, there's a huge range. Roma, Crimean Tatars, racial discrimination, there's economic, there's religious discrimination. So this law covers a huge part of Ukraine's population. It's not just half of it, not just women. This was all revisited again as well in the context of the UN, OHCHR. So the UN was very much in support of this being signed. And it was the basis after which the law was expanded with help from the UN, including schedules and goals for implementing a future national human rights strategy. So in 2016, the seeds were planted through this law, anti-discrimination, and in 2021, Zelensky signed the National Human Rights Strategy into law. Why is this so important? Because now war crimes can be investigated in Ukraine in the context of this National Human Rights Strategy, which has the backing of the UN already. So what work had been done already in society through a lot of I would really say as well, a lot of participation from LGBTQ and gender community, a lot of visibility in those women's marches and Kyiv marches. All of that has contributed to laying the groundwork now where investigations can take place in Ukraine on a huge number of war crimes that go way beyond only gender and LGBT issues. So all of this is great, but what, if anybody here wants to look up the human rights strategy, it's decree number 119/2021. So for research, it makes it easier if you want to look it up. It includes in the law prevention and countering discrimination and ensuring equal rights and opportunities for women and men. It also has a lot of provisions for military veterans and internally displaced peoples in Ukraine, of which now there are millions and millions more than there were even in 2021 when this strategy was signed. All of this will be very important for Ukraine joining the EU, and so will revisiting the history of women's activism throughout the 2000s, which shows steady progress, shows that civil society in Ukraine, even through different changes in the presidency, even through 2 revolutions in 2005, 2013, 14, even through the pandemic, you can look at women's and gender activism for case studies and trajectories that are solid and continually progressing throughout this whole period. And not only on the left, it's again, not a left-right issue, even though there was in Ukraine, just like everywhere else in Europe, a rise of a far right in 2016 that troubled and politicized a lot of this activism, trying to push it onto the left only. And some political scientists like Luke and Wei have written about the phenomenon of the far right in Ukraine. I'm not an expert on that in particular, but I would cite his work in saying that he argues Ukraine became actually a normal country because it was behaving in the same way as Western industrialized capitalist nations throughout Europe and the US were behaving at this time in 2016 with a rise of a far right. If there was no rise of the far right, Ukraine would be an anomaly, an outstanding outlier as a test case. And the numbers of the opposition to these marches in Kyiv were relatively small and ineffectual. So the anti-gender slogans, which I know also were very common in Poland, because in my anthology, Agnieszka Graf, a very well-known scholar of feminism and gender in Poland, she writes a lot about the far right in Poland and the rise of the sort of combination of anti-gender with anti-EU as a foreign export to this space of Eastern Europe, where in the Ukrainian context, there are some different nuances. Of course, it's not an equivalency to the Polish or Belarusian case, but there are patterns here that one can trace. Of course, the features of disinformation are also here in women's and gender movements and the development of human rights. And you can learn a lot by looking very closely at how different ideas of feminism provoked sort of a appropriation of Soviet era propaganda and historical discourse, in which opposition to women's movements would often use the idea of feminism not only as a xenophobic export from the West, but also as a Soviet holdover in which all feminists were attacked as Bolsheviks, or again, leftists in the old sense of leftists, historical leftists, and should be decommunized. So in Ukraine, there was really a trap set for feminists and women activists by the far right opposition, in which the discourse was manipulated to be either Western or Soviet at the same time, which is an oxymoron. And this is a way of undoing intellectual sovereignty. It's a way of creating a trap that is an impossible one to argue out of, because it's coming from both sides at the same moment. So in disinformation, those were the two main strategies being used, and you can see these features still today in much Kremlin disinformation about any attacks on Ukrainian civil society. So it's valuable to look a little more deeply into cases in gender and women's discourse for lessons that can be applied more broadly or understood in the future in rebuilding Ukraine and insulating it against some of this disinformation that would attack civil society activists as being either Soviet Bolshevik or export xenophobic agents of the West. These are the two kind of areas that the Kremlin uses to attack. And certainly culture, as I mentioned, has played a very important role in communication about gender identities, about also veteran experiences. A lot of the different artists that I've engaged with and writers have worked in a multifaceted capacity, oftentimes as anthropologists, because around 2014, 2015, Ukrainian government and international organizations started to invest a lot more into cultural activities near the front line of the occupied territories in Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast in particular, and also in Mariupol. Mariupol became a cultural center of activity and even had 2 or 3 very well-known NGOs for women and gender. And one of them, the TU platform, is still ongoing. I don't know what their current circumstances are, but they have amassed an archive of experience in Mariupol that was and is a record, actually, by civic observers, non-governmental, many artists, maybe some of them more established than others. Some of them are novices or students, but this is a testimony and a valuable collection of archival material that researchers maybe are not yet aware of, but can be important for rebuilding and looking at perspectives from those who locally have lived and experienced and also thought critically about their environments in southern and eastern Ukraine. So I don't want to take up all of our time today, but I did want to just note that certainly, the numbers of people that are affected by this war, the millions displaced living abroad now, many of them are women and children, and the impact of martial law has created a completely new context for thinking about gender identity when one is restricted by one's gendered legislative category in official terms. There only being 2 categories right now in laws in Ukraine, man or woman, and no same-sex marriage. This situation will create an entire new set of discourses and case studies for those of us who are looking and tracking closely gender and legislation in Ukraine. And I think there will certainly be some silver linings. I think it's good to stay optimistic and also to see the incredible openness that has arisen in Ukraine in the context since 2022 to thinking about introducing things like same-sex marriage. There was actually a bill put on the table less than a year ago that couldn't pass because martial law is happening, but that bill for same-sex marriage received many, many signatures in Ukraine. I don't know if that would have happened before 2022, maybe would have taken much longer to see that happen, but there is a willful consciousness now to even, I think, rebuild Europe and rebuild some of the values in Europe that have been degraded and disintegrating well before the war and outside of any context of the war. And this includes attacks on same-sex marriage. You can see in Poland very, very clear cases of this, but all throughout the EU. So Ukraine may have now a golden opportunity in the rebuilding to be the avant-garde leader and to really forward all of the motion that has been made for women's rights and human rights into a more intellectually sovereign, more pluralistic Ukraine that Europe can follow. And in this sense, Ukraine will not only be rebuilding itself, Ukraine will really be rebuilding a lot of Western values that are unfairly labeled Western because they're not only coming from the West, they're coming directly internally from Ukraine's activists who are already fighting for these values long before the war even started. So that's why I think it's so important to always return to the drawing board and see what history in Ukraine and what Ukrainians have already done for themselves, because all the groundwork you can see has been laid. And now we just have to work to keep that energy going. And as soon as it becomes safer for more and more of these gatherings and essential discussions to take place inside Ukraine, I think it will be even easier and more effective change that can be brought about. So thank you very much, and I look forward to our conversations.
Thank you, Jessica, for your contribution, for your support. We are a bit out of sync with our schedule, so my apologies to Nicolas Imbert from France, and I'm giving floor to him. Thank you, Jessica. Nicolas, the floor is yours.
Дякую, Павло. Дуже приємно. Я дуже радий завжди виступати у вашому університеті. Зараз я не знаю, чи мій екран, чи ви можете побачити мій екран?
Бачимо, дякую, чудово.
Супер. Тобто, декілька слів про мене. Мене звати Ніколя Аймберт, я француз, аспірант в університеті епохи називається. Я пишу докторську дисертацію про розділення православних церков в Україні, тому що я фахівець, спеціаліст державних церковних стосунок і намагаюся розуміти, які є трансформації в цих стосунках. Ось. Зараз я би хотів вам показати про мою дисертацію, яку я зараз пишу. Тобто я намагаюся розуміти розділення цих церков в Україні через призму самоідентифікації православних українців, які живуть в Західній Європі. Тому що, як ви знаєте, дуже багато у нас українців, які живуть у Франції і в Західній Європі. Я намагаюся розуміти, настільки війна і досвід перебування за кордоном впливає на їхню віру і їхню практику, і як вони сприймають цей розділ православних церков в Україні під час війни. Значить, як я хочу сказати, вивчення релігійного феномену в Україні є цікавим з різних причин. Чому важливо вивчати релігійне питання в Україні? По-перше, тому що структурно православна релігія в країнах цієї конфесії відіграє певну роль у розвитку національної ідентичності. У воєнний час це особливо актуально. По-друге, тому що у православних країнах поділ між релігійною сферою та політичною сферою не такий сильний, як на Заході. Цікаві зв'язки між політикою, релігією та культурою є, і ось чому я намагаюся це досліджувати. По-третє, тому що релігія також є елементом м'якої сили, інструментом впливу на суспільство, які можуть мобілізувати різні інституції, тобто політика, ЗМІ чи самі церкви. Ось. Далі. Кілька історичних фактів про православ'я в Україні. Ви це краще знаєте, чим я, звичайно, але дуже важливо є так, я так вважаю, казати трошки про ці історичні факти. Історія Київської митрополії завжди була тісно пов'язана з історією політичних режимів, які контролювали територію України. Ось чому, як релігієзнавець і політолог, для мене дуже важливо на це бачити з боку соціології і історії. Ось. Після зближення козацтва з Московським царством, зокрема під впливом Івана Самойловича, Константинопольський патріарх Діонісій IV отримав від Москви гроші за те, що Московський патріарх висвятив київського митрополита. Це також дуже актуально. Ви зрозумієте, чому я кажу про Константинопольську церкву. Ось. Але це не була зміна юрисдикції, канонічно. Тому що Київська митрополія завжди була підпорядкована Константинопольському патріархату. Ось. Ви зрозумієте, чому я кажу про ці зв'язки між Константинопольською церквою і Україною. Саме в ім'я цієї початкової канонічної залежності Константинопольський патріарх у 2018 році вирішив скликати об'єднавчий собор православних церков для створення автокефальної церкви в Україні, яка називається зараз Православна церква України. Загальний вступ про ці церкви православні, які існують зараз в Україні. У нас Православна церква України, як ви знаєте, яка була створена Константинопольським патріархатом з результатом об'єднавчого собору в грудні 18-го року під керівництвом митрополита Київського Епіфана. Ця церква автокефальна. Я також хочу вам казати, що автокефальні, що таке бути автокефальною, це просто абсолютно незалежна церква. Ось це, скажімо так, канонічний термін, щоб описати незалежність якоїсь церкви в православ'ї. Вона має широку підтримку населення українського, ЗМІ та української держави. Потім є також одна церква, яка розділена від ПЦУ, це УПЦ МП, Українська православна церква Московського патріархату. Це найстаріша православна церква в Україні, яка має багато культових будівель. Донедавна офіційно орендувала приміщення Києво-Печерської лаври. Вона ще досі знаходиться в Почаєві. Цю церкву очолює митрополит Онуфрій. Ця церква сьогодні маргіналізована українською державою, ЗМІ та українським населенням через її канонічні та історичні зв'язки з російською церквою, як ви знаєте. Ось. Я зробив спеціально для вас цю картинку, щоб мати загальну картину про різні православні церкви в Україні. У нас ось ПЦУ, ПЦУ була створена за допомогою двома церквами, це УПЦ-КП і УАПЦ. Я хочу казати, що чому Константинопольський патріархат собі дозволив дати томос, тобто незалежність української церкви. Тому що, починаючи з 28-го канону Халдінського собору в 5 столітті, Константинопольська церква користується першістю честі в православній церкві. Це почесна першість, але існує давна дискусія в православі щодо того, що означає ця першість і які права пов'язані з цією першістю. Ось. Щодо УАПЦ, це Українська автокефальна православна церква, вона була створена після жовтневої революції в 1918 1919 році з метою створення незалежної національної церкви в Україні. Ось. І діяльність були зупинені радянським урядом в 30-ті роки, але вона продовжувала діяти в діаспорі. Ось. В 1989 році УАПЦ була відновлена в Україні, і в 2018 році, після надання автокефалії, УАПЦ об'єдналась з двома іншими українськими церквами, щоб створити православну церкву в Україні. Ось. А далі у нас Українська православна церква Київський патріархат. Ця церква була створена в 90-х. Ось коли митрополит Філарет відірвався від московського патріархату в знак протесту проти його політики. УПЦ КП оголосила себе автокефальною церквою де-факто зі своїм патріархатом у Києві, як ви це знаєте. Ця церква боролася за визнання в інших православних церквах, але не отримала широкого визнання до 18-го року. Ну, тобто, скажімо так, що ПЦУ є зараз церквою канонічною, якщо можна так сказати, оскільки отримала цей автокефалію від будь-якої вищої церкви, тобто Константинопольський патріархат, хоча є ще декілька церков в світі, які ще не можуть признавати цю церкву. Ось. Я також хочу нагадати, що митрополит Філарет Денисенко, який був главою Київського патріархату і ще зараз є главою Київського патріархату, він був колишнім екзархом, потім митрополітом УПЦ МП 66 по 90 років. Він був великим противником автокефалії на цьому моменті, але в 90-ті він кардинально змінив свою позицію. Ось. Також у нас далі, як ви це можете бачити, Московський патріархат і УПЦ. Ось. Я тут написав декілька речей, тобто, по-перше, у соборі, який був у 18-му році, щоб створити УПЦУ, лише два митрополіти УПЦ взяли участь на цей собор. А решті епіскопів Московський патріархат заборонив взяти участь, і також іншим нібито завадив Порошенко. Тобто один митрополіт, який взяв участь на цей собор, щоб для створення ПЦУ, мені розповів, що Порошенко нібито завадив 7 епіскопам УПЦ МП, щоб взяти участь на цей собор. Чому? Тому що якби вони взяли участь на цей собор, вони могли би, скажімо так, взяти владу, скажімо так, і бути на граві цієї нової церкви. Ось. Також щодо канонічних зв'язок між УПЦ і МП, як ви знаєте, був собор УПЦ у травні останнього року, 22-го року, але все-таки канонічна ситуація УПЦ неоднозначна. Будь-яке посилання на Московську церкву, РПЦ, було вилучено зі статуту УПЦ, але правова основа, стаття 1, наприклад, посилається на грамоту патріарха РПЦ Олексія II, яка підтверджує, до речі, залежність УПЦ від РПЦ. Далі. Я хотів казати про те, що, звичайно, ось одна з останніх публікацій про релігійну приналежність, і це підтверджує, це зниження релігійної приналежності до УПЦ МП. Як ви можете бачити, тільки зараз 4% православних українців вважають себе членами до УПЦ МП. Ось. Далі також дуже цікаво, що цей другий документ ще цікавіший, тому що він висвітлює еволюцію юрисдикційних приналежностей серед українців православного віросповідання. спостерігається зниження почуття приналежності до УПЦ ще до масштабного вторгнення, і з моменту створення ПЦУ спостерігається помітне посилення почуттів приналежності. Ось. Також можна бачити, що є різке скорочення складу Київського патріархату, і це легко пояснити, тому що більшість духовенства та вірних цієї церкви перейшли до ПЦУ у 18 році. Ось. Також, але важливо також відзначати одну річ, станом на 2019 рік, відносна більшість православних не надає такого значення юрисдикційній приналежності, оскільки там, як ви можете це бачити, більшість з них просто вважають себе православними. Ось. Далі. Ось про те, що я хочу казати, ми можемо помітити, що є втрата впливу УПЦ на українське суспільство. Так, зараз. Ось. Через, звісно, канонічні зв'язки з московським патріархатом УПЦ втратила величезний вплив на українське суспільство. Ось. Проте існують методологічні упередження. Це дуже важливо також на це звертати увагу, які необхідно враховувати, дивлячись на цифри. По-перше, є значна частина людей, які називають себе православними, але не належать до певної церкви, як ми це казали, більше 24% у цьому році, тобто 23-го. Через страх осуду з боку суспільства віруючі УПЦ можуть відмовитися відповідати на соціологічні анкети та публічно заявляти про свою приналежність до УПЦ. Наприклад, я також зробив веб-етнографію, тобто це етнографія, але в інтернеті, і я помітив, що віруючі УПЦ МП не публічно казали, що вони належать до УПЦ МП, ось, саме через цей страх осуду. Okay? От, по-третє, важливо враховувати деталі конфесійної приналежності. Саме тут якісний підхід може допомогти кількісному підходу. І це, до речі, мій підхід. Тому що, як ви знаєте, є різні соціологічні підходи. По-перше, кількісний підхід дає можливість аналізувати соціальні факти за допомогою статистичних даних за певним методом. Цей метод дає загальний огляд суспільства та деяких його явищ. Також є якісний метод, швидше прагне зрозуміти, чому, тобто він не протиставляється першому підходу, але допомагає зрозуміти нюанси та значення, які люди вкладають у свої відповіді. Щоб зрозуміти цей поділ, принаймні інституційний, я прийняв етнографічний метод, тобто розуміти, як живуть українці православного віросповідання в Західній Європі. Загальний вступ. Тобто є такі питання, коли я починав досліджувати різні парафії православних українських в Західній Європі. Чи є ми свідками метаморфоза релігійних шляхів українських біженців при досвіді біженства? Якщо війна в Україні глибоко викристалізувала українське суспільство, чи змінила вона релігійну практику українців в Європі? Якщо так, то чому і як? І які еквівалентності та відмінності між релігійними приналежностями можна помітити? Ось моя теоретична призма етнографічного аналізу. Тобто, по-перше, я хочу аналізувати відчуття конфесійної приналежності до православної церкви в загальному сенсі. Тобто, що це означає відчути приналежність до православної церкви, до цього сповідання віри. Ось. Також відчуття приналежності до одної церкви на інституційному рівні. Тобто, чи православні українці, які собі поважають православними, відчувають також приналежність до якоїсь церкви, чи це для них дійсно важливо. Ось. І по-третє, відчуття приналежності до певної парафії. Чи можемо відчувати будучи православними і відчуваючи чинні приналежність до якоїсь церкви, чи ми також відчуваємо, що ми належимо до парафії без чи з цими вище згаданими релігійними приналежностями. Тобто я намагаюся розуміти ось ці приналежності по різними рівнями. Ось. Мій вибір наукової вибірки, звичайно, щоб вибрати вибірку для дослідження, необхідно поставити два основних питання. Доступність і релевантність чи актуальність вибірки. По-перше, доступність означає можливість проводити достатньо часу з віруючими, я маю на увазі, щоб зрозуміти, як вони живуть. Це означає, це називається повне занурення, французькою це буде immersion комплет, досліджування середовища. Також актуальність. Чи дають змогу вибрані місця відповісти на гіпотези. Ось. Я обрав досліджувати українську парафію Константинопольського патріархату на півдні Франції та українську парафію УПЦ в Брюсселі. А чому цей вибір? Тому що, по-перше, я живу недалеко від Марселя поки що, і я хотів просто вивчити, досліджувати українську православну парафію. Ось. Тому що ця церква, яку я зараз вам покажу, вона це одна з небагатьох церков у Марселі, культурно-українська, по-друге, тому що вона належить Константинопольському патріархату. Уточнюю дуже важливу річ. Вона належить безпосередньо Константинопольському патріархату, тому що і без посередництва ПЦУ, тому що Константинопольський патріархат не погоджується на створення парафії ПЦУ за кордоном. Чому? Бо вважає, що права автокефальної церкви обмежені і канонічною територією, тобто Україною в нашому випадку. Ось. Ось так. Також я вибрав для вивчення одну з найбільших парафій УПЦ МП у Брюсселі, тому що оскільки УПЦ відкрила свої церкви за кордоном, цей другий вибір мотивований тим, що це одна з найактивніших церков УПЦ за кордоном. Ось. Тому я хотів порівняти етнографічні результати між цими двома різними парафіями, щоб спробувати зрозуміти, як досвід перебування за кордоном змінює конфесійну приналежність та їхні стосунки візаві поділу православних церков в Україні. І чи змінюється юрисдикційна приналежність у віруючих. Ось. Так, ось, як ви можете бачити, це перша церква, яку я досліджую. Ця фотка, це я зробив цю фотографію. Це церква святого Іоргія в Марселі, Константинопольського патріархату. Раніше ця парафія була російської традиції, церква з частини білої російської еміграції, РПЦЗ, це руська зарубіжна церква, яка не хотіла приєднуватися до Московського патріархату РПЦЗ. З початком масштабного вторгнення ця парафія пройшла через процес українізації, будучи при цьому вже давно під Константинопольським патріархатом. Тобто до масштабного вторгнення ця парафія, хоча вона була російської традиції, вона ніколи не була під Московським патріархатом, завжди під Константинопольським патріархатом. Багато парафіян з різних районів України, Херсон, Львів, Київ, Харків. Одні приїхали до війни, інші після війни. Більшість українці і є також грузини. Ось. Ця церква також пов'язана з парафією Воскресіння Христового в Тулоні. Церква російської традиції також всередині Константинопольського патріархату, яка також приймає багато українців, яка залежить від КП. Найцікавіше те, що я помітив, що є віруючі у цій парафії, які приходять до цих двох церков, але офіційно належать до УПЦ. УПЦ-МП. Деякі навіть казали мені, що вони з Московського патріархату, але через культурні, дружні та національні зв'язки вони приходять до цієї Константинопольської парафії. Хоча вони ніколи не ходили би до церков ПЦУ в Україні. Ось чому це дуже цікаво помітити, що досвід перебування в іншій країні за кордоном впливає на їхню практику. Ось, наприклад, вона, парафіянка мені розповіла злозами в очах, що вона з УПЦ МП, коли вона спілкувалася по телефону зі своїм духовним отцем з України, він заборонив її ходити до цієї церкви. І вона все-таки мені розповіла, що вона собі вважає член, скажімо так, парафіянкою Московського патріархату, але все-таки тут вона відчувала благодать, як вона це говорила ось мені. Тому що дуже цікаво, що досвід за кордоном впливає на світогляд і на думку віруючих щодо релігії. Це, звичайно, змінюється. Зустріч цих вірних дає змогу побачити, що не завжди є точна відповідність між конфесійною, юрисдикційною та парафільною приналежністю. Що я маю тут на увазі? Я маю на увазі, що, наприклад, ця парафіянка, вона належить від УПЦ МП, як вона мені так казала, але все-таки ходить до церкви, яка належить до Константинопольського патріархату. Ось. Тому що тут немає відповідності між цими приналежностями. Далі, інша парафія, яку я досліджував, це парафія УПЦ усіх преподобних Києво-Печерських у Брюсселі, УПЦ МП. Ця парафія в Брюсселі має багато парафіян, близько 150-200 щонеділі. Більшість з Чернівецької області. Ось. За словами священника, більшість віруючих прибули ще до війни. Ось. Літургія служиться церковнослов'янською мовою, але Євангеліє читається українською та румунською мовами. Мені вдалося поспілкуватися з різними учасниками хору, церковного хору. Одні приїхали до війни, інші після. Раніше декілька ходили в російську церкву, але віддали перевагу перейти до української, коли відкрили цю парафію влітку останнього року. Приналежність до УПЦ є для них досить важливою, тому що вони б не ходили до церкви ПЦУ, якби була б можливість за кордоном. Тобто це треба тільки УПЦ. Ось. Не всі мають однакову думку про фактичне членство як факт УПЦ до РПЦ. Одні кажуть, що УПЦ віддавалась від РПЦ, інші ні. Найцікавіше те, що Брюссель – велика столиця з сильною українською громадою, але можна припустити, що більшість вірних походять із Чернівців не лише тому, що священник теж румуномовний, а й тому, що в Західній Україні тенденційно вищий відсоток релігійної практики за умови, звичайно, перевіряки та порівняння кількісних і якісних даних. Ось декілька цифр, де ви можете бачити, що в Заході України більше людей відвідують релігійні служби. Ось. Далі. Також є дуже великі усвідомлення про членство до певної релігійної громади в Заходній Україні. Ось. І ось мої тимчасові висновки моєї роботи. Через агресивне бачення російської церкви щодо війни багато православних українців шукають за кордоном етнічну українську церкву. Це, я би сказав, саме головне. Це може бути Константинопольський патріархат, це може бути греко-католики, це може бути УПЦ. Саме головне, щоб це була українська церква. Насправді, багато українців, як я сказав, відвідують греко-католицькі храми, не зважаючи на те, що вони православні. Якщо усвідомлення приналежності є сильним до УПЦ, навіть якщо ми бачимо різноманіття думок щодо канонічного статусу УПЦ, бачимо певну трансформацію релігійної практики на півдні Франції, наприклад, як я вам розповів. Незважаючи на наявність багатьох дуже різних православних церков, грецької, румунської традиції, тощо, деякі все одно ходили до російської церкви до відкриття українських церков, тому що вони казали мені, що не мали вибору. Але це, звичайно, подібність обрядів, тому що там служать церковнослов'янською, є слов'янська традиція. І ця подібність обрядів створила у них таке враження, що немає вибору іншого. Деякі належать до парафії Константинопольського патріархату, особливо на півдні Франції, тому що це також створення соціального зв'язку. Вони приходять переважно тому, що вони українці, або тому, що мають друзів, навіть якщо можуть мати кардинально різні погляди щодо церкви. Тобто я зустрівся з багатьма різних віруючих, багатьма різними парафіянами там, які мали абсолютно різні погляди щодо церкви і щодо поділу православних церков в Україні. Хоча вони все-таки всі ходили до одної церкви. Тому що тут у них є друзі і є можливість, скажімо так, підтримувати соціальний зв'язок. Загалом ми помічаємо, що для вірних найважливішою є етнічна приналежність церкви до української ідентичності та близькість релігійних обрядів. Ось я би сказав, що це поки що мої висновки моєї роботи, моєї дисертації. Я дякую вам за запрошення. Я вибачаюсь за мій український, я тільки 7 місяців вивчаю українську, але ще не так з вимовою. Дякую.
Ніколя, дуже дякуємо. Your Ukrainian is just brilliant. It's just brilliant and thank you. Дякую за дуже цікаву презентацію. Будемо її вивчати і обговорювати. Тематика дуже актуальна і гостра. Ще раз дуже дякую. Неймовірно вдячний. І я маю честь і приємність запросити до слова теж нашу давню
in Ukraine. So actually, this is NGO, but I don't see my presentation, but maybe Pavlo will show. I don't know, but I will shortly explain what we are doing, because for us war started in 2014, and our organization we moved. We are scientists actually, and we moved to Donetsk and Lugansk region, and we have been to all phases of the war. So it was emergency, stabilization, and development phases of the war. So we reconstruct 28 objects of infrastructure, and in this object of social cohesion, we organize meeting with internally displaced people and hosting communities. Now our organization focus, maybe Pavlo will switch on. It's okay if no. So now
cannot find it, sorry.
It's in your mail. But our organization right now focus on humanitarian support. We still continue implementing gender policy through resolution Women, Peace and Security. And especially on our web page, you can find Women to Ukraine, W2U. You can find our research, which we did during 2022. During 2022, we opened 8 new schools in Ukraine, and we creating, actually, we are authors, and we created before, since 2014, 20 schools of peace in Ukraine, in different parts of Ukraine. 5 of our schools of peace are totally destroyed right now. We separately teach children and separately teach teachers. We teach non-violence communication, mediation, transformation of conflict. Because for us, the main idea, we want our children, it's very difficult nowadays, you know, to reflect without violence, because violence is all around us, unfortunately, and we want our children to feel humans inside and to understand this, you know, human rights-based approach. So now we are focusing on creating schools of peace. We would like to continue this, and we want to also focus on psychological support, because during 2022 we had a hotline, because in Mykolaiv region, and next one, in Mykolaiv region we have humanitarian hub. This is actually our humanitarian hub, and right now we cover also Mykolaiv and Kherson region, and also next one, this is actually platform what I told you about, Women to Ukraine, and we are one of 5 NGOs who created this platform, and we're strengthening civil society organizations. 5 civil society organizations has their capacity building during this year, and they implemented their projects. Mostly it was, of course, women organization, because, you know, men are on the war, and we have to focus what we can do. Now, thank you to my colleague who pay attention to these questions, because now women work 24 hours per day. I'm also mother of child, and I'm from Kakhovka, which is under occupation right now, and this big tragedy which created by Russian Federation in Dump, which was totally destroyed, and its influence to not only up to 20,000 people directly. During evacuation, because we are taking part in evacuation, we have humanitarian hub, as I told you, and we have volunteers in Kherson. And 28 volunteers right now trying to still evacuate people, but we face with another problem. People don't want to leave their homes. They expect that, you know, this water maybe will go down and they can return home. But of course, we try to negotiate and to move them to another parts of Ukraine. And so you can show next slides, and I will comment. I told you we focus on resolution 3025, and we organized research about mapping. So we did mapping of stakeholders, and also we did recommendations. So how we can influence to local authorities to solve this catastrophe which we have on our communities, how to reflect on government level, next one, and also we work with stakeholders. I think it's very important to focus also in the future to development of social businesses, because we had good examples of Donetsk and Lugansk region when we start rebuild Donbass, and we had the strategy how to do it. We focus on social enterprises. We don't have jurisdictional form in Ukraine of social enterprises, but we still have it's in reality not a legal form of such enterprises. And right now we implementing we are one of who implement different democratic instruments in Ukraine, especially school participatory budgeting. When our schools, our children creating their projects, their own projects, they have real elections through digital platforms. They just use phones to vote for their own projects. And in schools in Donetsk and Lugansk region, what was successful story? This is social school, social enterprises. It was really successful stories, and I think it can be good examples right now when we have the occupied communities, when we want them to start their life. So next one, our organization, we evacuated people from more than 300 people, and especially we evacuated people with disabilities from Kharkiv last year to Sweden. Next one, next, and more, because this is about gender policy and how we reflect on this situation. Yes, next, because of destroying of object of critical infrastructure right now. Next, and we had really successful stories about social cohesion in our communities, and I think we will focus in the future in our communities right now, all over Ukraine, not only Donetsk, Lugansk communities, because it was very strong social cohesion activities on the basis of that object of infrastructure. So mostly we rebuilt public places like libraries, like musician schools, houses of culture, and another one. Next one, Pablo. And the most important thing, next, maybe even next. So we also had, you can stop here. We also created School of Volunteer when we prepared people in the communities how to do input to your community. So we had right now 800 volunteers in all parts of Ukraine, and which give us an instrument of mobilization, fast mobilization. So how we work in Mykolaiv and Kherson region, it's fast mobilization of community, because since 2014, we organize this School of Volunteers when we teach people first how to do input to your community in different spheres, in sport, in education, in culture, how to be volunteer in your community. So That's why this is also really good examples how to mobilize community through such schools of volunteers and explaining how to be a volunteer. And next, maybe we were volunteers in different, and this is actually picture from occupied Kakhovka, now occupied Kakhovka, before full-scale invasion. We also strengthening small communities and rural areas, because we were really active during reform of decentralization. And actually, I think that due to this reform of decentralization, we have such strong communities right now, and they reflect to emergency, to stabilization. And next one, Pablo. So it's youth exchanges, because we share experience in different countries through different programs and projects with young people. Next. Also, we have also project which is energy of generations. So we found, and all our actually projects based on research-based solutions. So first we did research, and then we implement projects which cover needs which we found and demand which is in these territories. So absolutely all our projects based on research-based solutions, on assessments, and for example, we found that there is a huge gap between generations, older and younger people, and we found the way how to do this energy of generations. So through cultural activities like older people teach young people how to dance valse, and we organize ball for both of these groups. Or younger generation teach older generation how to use gadgets. Also very needed thing, you know. And next, and this is examples of our School of Peace, because we create physically places. And next one, and we created physically, this is murals inside our schools, and very often children are authors of these murals. Next one, because actually they have motivation to do drafts. And next slides, and we implement their dreams. Sometimes it's open classes, and we have several open classes in different parts of Ukraine, and we invite business to help, local business to help with organization of such classes. Next one. And this is painting actually of 12 years girl, and she did drawing, and together with painters we implement this. It's not mural, it's graffiti inside school, because we want also to show that graffiti is this is art, this is street, but it can be inside school, why not? And this girl, she was ill, and actually, I was not for this draft, but we have democracy in schools, and they vote, children vote for this mural. So we have such mural inside Кам'янець-Подільський school in Khmelnytsk region. Next one. And this is small examples, because artists always invite children to participate in creation of murals. Next one. And we organize children camps and youth camps. And this year, due to support with of US Embassy, we would like to organize camp for students, lawyers, and want to teach them how to work with war crime. And we want to do social cohesion between these groups of young people, that they work with these cases in the future. The next one. And this is examples from different parts of Ukraine, which physical places we created. But the most important next one, that we want to implement institutional, and institutional, this is some pictures from our schools of peace, where we teach children and separately teachers, but together they are in the camps. And next one. And of course, we want peace in our country. So all what we are doing, it's directed to reach our peace, to get back our lands, and to have our freedom. And maybe my colleagues have questions. I will be really glad to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you for your presentation, and not just a presentation, but for everything you have been doing for a long time, and especially during these tough and tragic times of Russian aggression, Russian war, atrocious war against Ukraine. Ukraine would not have been there where it is without people like you, without your civic activism, without your compassion, commitment, and efficiency. We are really grateful to you. Okay, let us move on, and we'll be thinking about your presentation and getting back both to your presentation, to your ideas, initiatives, and to you.
Thank you so much. You can share my contacts, and I'm really glad to cooperate. And thank you, my colleagues from Europe, from US, for supporting our communities, our people, and great thanks for military support right now. It's much important, save lives and to defend our country. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We stay in touch. And we keep up good work and continue our cooperation. Now I would like to give the floor to our valued partner and friend from Odessa Law Academy, Associate Professor of Sociology, Yulia Shmalenko, who's going to talk about the ethical dimensions of online mediation, extremely topical issue. Okay, thank you, Юлія. The floor is yours. Запрошуємо до слова.
Дякую велике організаторам за можливість долучитися до вашої конференції. Дякую всім учасникам, з захопленням слухала всі доповіді. Наразі вони є цікавими і, звісно, шкода, що немає можливості подискутувати, тому що я розумію, що в електронному форматі ми дещо обмежені в часі. І якраз сьогоднішню тему, яку я обирала саме те, що стосується медіації в онлайн-форматі, відповідно з усіма можливостями і з усіма перешкодами, яка сьогодні існують в цьому випадкові. Коли ми говоримо про онлайн-медіацію, наразі в цифрову епоху медіаторам відкриваються нові можливості, нові ресурси, які можна використовувати для забезпечення ефективної та успішної медіації, яка є важливою складовою процесу врегулювання конфліктів. І це отримує все більше популярності та значення в умовах сучасних глобальних змін. Наразі слід підкреслити, що онлайн-медіація до недавнього часу не була поширена як в усьому світі, так і в Україні, зокрема. До пандемії, яка відбулася, нам здається, що та пандемія взагалі її не було порівняно з останніми подіями, ми вже і забули, що була пандемія, що був коронавірус. Але наразі до пандемії медіатори та інші практики переговорів частіше наполягали, що онлайн-медіація, вона, якщо і можливо, то дещо в обмеженому форматі, А особисті зустрічі, вони були більш актуальними, тому що онлайн-медіація, вона позбавлена, що називається, такого людського дотику, такої людяності. Немає того тепла, енергії, мови тіла, тобто тих тонких факторів, тих тонких чинників, які складають основні інгредієнти, пов'язані з медіацією, і включають довіру, співпереживання та взаємопорозуміння. Але коли весь світ війшов у 2020 році в карантинні заходи і обмеження соціального дистанціювання, оцей опір онлайн-практиків переговорів, його було миттєво знищено, і довелося і медіаторам в тому числі переміститися в інтернет. І цей масовий перехід до онлайн-розв'язання конфліктів, він змусив багатьох визнати, що насправді альтернативні процеси вирішення суперечок можливі бути успішними і навіть процвітати в онлайн-форматі. Судові та позасудові способи вирішення суперечок також почали переходити до онлайн-режиму. І якщо подивитися на Google статистику під час пандемії, то словосполучення пошук онлайн-врегулювання спорів в пошуковому запиті складав за часи пандемії майже 146 мільйонів разів. Тобто це свідчить про те, що онлайн-формат переговорів, онлайн-формат врегулювання суперечок чи конфліктних проблем, він є вкрай актуальним для людей, які через певні карантинні обмеження, чи зараз, як ми бачимо, як це відбувається в Україні, обмеження пов'язані з воєнними подіями, не мають повноцінного доступу до державних ресурсів, до судового врегулювання суперечок. Тому онлайн-медіація, вона поступово починає використовуватися і активно входить в наше життя. Що стосується України, то до недавнього часу онлайн-медіація не була поширена, як я казала, майже в усьому світі, але події останніх років – це безпосередньо і пандемія, і повномасштабна війна, яка розпочалася майже 1,5 роки тому, вона поставила і створила нові умови, нові можливості і вимусила медіаторів швидко адаптуватися до тих умов, з якими зустрілися українські медіатори безпосередньо. Реагуючи на ці виклики, Національна асоціація медіаторів в Україні в 2021 році прийняла перший і поки що єдиний нормативно-правовий документ, який стосується врегулювання онлайн-медіації в Україні. Це рекомендації щодо підготовки та проведення онлайн-медіації. І саме в цьому документі вперше було принаймні зроблена спроба надати певну необхідну підтримку для безпечного та професійного проведення медіації в онлайн-режимі. Коли ми говоримо про сучасні події, які відбуваються в Україні, ми говоримо про те, що і воєнний стан, і відповідно диджиталізація створюють певні умови, в яких онлайн-медіація набуває великого значення як приваблива альтернатива для успішного врегулювання конфліктів. Збільшення кількості конфліктів між громадянами, обмежений доступ до судів через карантинні обмеження, через воєнні події, а також відсутність належного енергопостачання через ракетні обстріли призводять до зростання попиту на онлайн-медіацію як засобу врегулювання конфліктів. Законодавче врегулювання медіації та онлайн-правосуддя може сприяти значному зменшенню навантаження на судову систему і, відповідно, забезпечить доступ до правосуддя всіх верств населення в умовах нової реальності. Онлайн-медіація використовує сучасні інформаційні технології, відповідно, вона сприяє ефективному та швидкому вирішенню спорів. Вона зберігає часові та фінансові ресурси, які було б витрачено при вирішенні судовим шляхом. Вона створює всі умови, де учасники можуть взаємодіяти та вирішувати свої конфлікти, знаходячись у власному безпечному оточенні, що є вкрай актуальним і важливим в умовах сучасного часу, коли не всі учасники конфлікту мають можливість без перешкоди дістатися безпосередньо до місця формальної медіації, якщо б така мала місце, а онлайн-режим якраз створює ці безпечні можливості, безпечні умови. І, відповідно, розвиток цифрових технологій, він створює і нові безпекові виклики для медіації, тому що тут підвищуються вимоги і до професійної здатності, до цифрової компетентності медіаторів, і, відповідно, підвищуються вимоги до професійної етики медіаторів. Успішна онлайн-медіація в умовах діджиталізації, вона вимагає певного забезпечення рівного доступу до онлайн-медіації, включаючи увагу до певних деталей, які необхідно прораховувати медіатору, якщо він входить в цю процедуру в онлайн-форматі. Мова буде йти про стабільність зв'язку і належного енергопостачання. Звісно, що від медіатора це не залежить, але тим не менш це необхідно проговорити з усіма учасниками конфлікту, тому що в тій ситуації, з якою зустрілися українці за останній рік, пов'язана з енергопостачанням, необхідно проговорити, чи є можливість доступу до інтернету, і відповідно, щоб цей інтернет-зв'язок був стабільний під час медіаційної сесії. Мова буде йти про якість технічних засобів комунікації, тобто і мова буде йти про цифрову грамотність учасників процесу. Якраз на цьому наголошували нещодавно на зустрічі медіаторів, коли провели дослідження, як якісно запроваджувати онлайн-медіацію, і говорили про те, що цифрова грамотність всіх учасників процесу – це є запорукою якісного процесу онлайн-медіації в сучасних умовах. Це, звісно, що медіатори мають бути ще такими своєрідними сучасними хакерами, тому що вони мають володіти різними альтернативними технічними засобами. І ми сьогодні навіть нашу конференцію можемо подивитися, що це можливість виходити на онлайн-конференцію з допомогою Zoom, за допомогою різноманітних дистанційних майданчиків, де ми маємо можливість комунікувати і продовжувати нашу дискусію. Відповідно, дотримання оцих технічних моментів, воно є важливим, але не менш важливим є дотримання етичних аспектів поведінки медіатора в цифровому середовищі. Це є критично важливим для забезпечення високого рівня професіоналізму та підвищення довіри до онлайн-медіаційного процесу. Звісно, що медіатори на всіх етапах медіаційного процесу, в тому числі використовуючи онлайн-майданчики, мають використовувати і дотримуватися принципів професійної етики. Тут мова буде йти і про ту ж саму конфіденційність, і про пристрасність, і про повагу до учасників, і про заборону використання конфіденційної інформації в особистих цілях. Але те, що стосується якраз цієї конфіденційної інформації, тут мова буде йти про те, що онлайн-медіація протистоїть такому важливому етичному виклику, пов'язаному із збереженням приватності в віртуальному просторі. Оскільки існує ризик порушення конфіденційності учасників через можливі виклики. Які це можуть бути виклики? Це, можливо, буде незаконний доступ до відеоконференції, це, можливо, збереження записів або роблення записів під час безпосередньо самої медіаційної сесії. Це, можливо, неправомірне використання особистих даних, і, відповідно, це є достатньо важливий етичний виклик, який має подолати медіатор. Як з цим викликом зараз наразі боротися, достатньо важко сказати, тому що під час проведення дистанційної сесії ми не знаємо, хто знаходиться по той бік екрану. Навіть якщо включена відеокамера, ми не впевнені, що поруч не знаходяться люди, які не будуть уважно спостерігати, давати свої коментарі чи якимось чином фіксувати те, що відбувається під час медіаційної процедури. Ми говоримо про те, що медіатори вони важливо для медіаторів оцінювати ці ризики і вживати заходи для забезпечення конфіденційності учасників. І, відповідно, що це може бути? Це використання безпечних та зашифрованих платформ для комунікації. Це мова буде йти про обмеження доступу до медіаційних сесій лише для авторизованих учасників. І це обговорення про те, що записи або збережені дані, їх мають бути видалені відповідно за попередньою домовленістю, або якщо мова буде йти про встановлені правила або нормативно-правові якісь обмеження. Проведення онлайн-медіації вимагає уваги до етичних питань, що виникають в онлайн-просторі. І, відповідно, це призводить до появи нових етичних дилем. Коли я почала розглядати цю тему в сучасних умовах, от тут ще одна етична дилема, яка ще не підіймалася, але наразі вона може бути актуальною. Це питання буде щодо використання штучного інтелекту в процесі медіації. Ми розуміємо, що штучний інтелект за останні кілька місяців активно війшов в наше життя, а ми активно його почали використовувати, і тому не виняток, так, і, скоріш за все, його можуть використовувати і в медіаторі в своєму процесі. Чи це можливо, чи це неможливо, чи це є коректно, чи це некоректно, чи це є етично або не етично, це ще є питання, яке лише тільки потребує на цю відповідь. Звісно, що тут мова буде йти про ті етичні дилеми, які пов'язані з розумінням етичних стандартів в віртуальному просторі або правил збереження та видалення даних, які отримані були під час онлайн-сесій. Медіатори мають усвідомлювати ці етичні виклики, приділяти їм належну увагу, вміло реагувати на них і керуватися безпосередньо моральними принципами, задля того, щоб знайти якомога кращі етично прийнятні рішення та врегулювати конфлікти і забезпечити ефективне проведення медіаційних процесів в онлайн-режимі. Загалом, якщо робити підсумок, то можна сказати, що онлайн-медіація сьогодні є потужним інструментом для врегулювання конфліктів в умовах воєнного конфлікту і в умовах отих карантинних обмежень, з якими ми зустрілися кілька років тому. Онлайн-медіація забезпечує доступ до правосуддя, онлайн-медіація сприяє ефективному вирішенню спорів, і, відповідно, вона сприяє і забезпечує збереженню здоров'я громадян, які беруть участь в цьому процесі в дистанційному форматі. І, звісно, що можна сказати і підсумовувати про те, що подальший розвиток онлайн-медіації, створення відповідно правового поля, він є достатньо важливим для сучасної України і для всієї світової медіаційної спільноти. А зараз дякую велике за можливість висловитися, для можливості взяти участь в вашій конференції.
Дуже дякую. Відкладаємо дискусію на потім, тому що наша трансляція закінчується 13:40. Thank you. And now I am honored to give the floor to our friend Nathan Greenfield. Nathan represents different countries, different institutions. He's had illustrious career, and he's writing extensively on issues of military history, equal or rather unequal access to education, and he's been covering war in Ukraine from its onset. And his today's talk is extremely timely, extremely topical, extremely important, relevant, and enlightening. And it's about Walter Benjamin's sociological treatment of war and violence.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly well. So thanks.
Okay, but I'm trying to share the screen, and now I'm having trouble doing that. Where to go?
Okay, wait. Okay, just a sec. Just a sec. Okay, you can start talking while I'll take care of your presentation.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much for having me. I'm speaking to you from Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, and I will get going. My topic is unpacking Walter Benjamin's sociology of violence and war. Walter Benjamin was born in 1892 and died of suicide in 1940. Thinking that he and his escape party would soon be overtaken by the Nazis. One of the members of that escape party was the philosopher Hannah Arendt. In 1936, he wrote an essay called The Storyteller, Reflections on the Works of Nikolai Leskov, a Russian novelist, short story writer, and playwright who died in 1895. In it, Benjamin makes one of his few direct references to war. Quote, with the First World War, a process began to become apparent, which is not halted since then. Was it not noticeable at the end of the war that men returned from the battlefield grown silent, not richer, but poorer in communicable experience? For never has experience been contradicted more thoroughly than the strategic experience of tactical warfare, bodily experience by mechanical warfare. This is about as close to as Benjamin gets to writing directly about battle, echoing Nietzsche is his focus on language, or to be more precise, the impossibility of language to contain the violence that the men experienced in 1418, that is to say, the First World War. In On Language and Such, and Language of Man, written in 1916, after rehearsing what philosophers concerned with language since Plato have all said, that thought cannot take place without language, that language is a second level way of knowing, that our mental image differs from its linguistic cognate, Benjamin turns to the first chapter of Genesis. Adam's naming of the birds, fish, and animals, and everything else. Somebody's mic is on. Everything else completes God's creation. God may have spoken the architecture of creation into being, but for the earthly world to be complete, Benjamin writes, Adam, a man, must perform these speech acts. This adequatio, the perfect equation between word and thing, that is to say, when Adam named, and there was a picture of that, but we can't get my slides up, begins to collapse when Satan gives Eve the knowledge of good and evil, knowledge from outside, the uncreated imitation of the creative word. But it is here, the birth of the human word, in which the name no longer lives intact, that is important. By the time we get to Babel, the multiplicity of languages leads inevitably to violence. Now fully human, language not only fails to contain violence, it is itself a form of violence. In a moment, we'll consider another essay, which he wrote in 1916, called The Critique of Violence. But for now, I want to jump 10 years to Benjamin's Habitualschrift, the Ursprung der Deutsche Schauspielen, the origins of German tragic drama. In this, he examines mourning plays that were written during the Baroque period, about the same time as Shakespeare wrote, and they can be thought of as a kind of German equivalent of Hamlet or Macbeth, with plenty of intrigue, murders, wars, and rumors of wars. Once again, Benjamin focuses on language and the ramifications of the fact that it is empty, a vessel to be filled with intentions by the intriguer, the courtier who schemes, or the sovereign seeking absolute power. Then later, this representation of history, he argues, who holds the course of history like a scepter in its hand. For the Baroque knows no eschatology. It is haunted by the idea that without an ultimate heaven, there is a vacuum that one day will be filled only to be destroyed with catastrophic violence. Thank you. Okay, so that would be Adam. We'll get to slide 4. Further manifestation of this violence is the creation of allegory and symbolism, where this stands for that. Next slide, please. And now we have we get to Milton Satan, where Milton Satan wages cruel war, first with language that is emptied of truth, and even such as the usurper, think of Macbeth again, who deploys language to effect what appears to be a, quote, ecclesiastical and political restoration. What we are witnessing is this violence, is the decay of language, manifested in the world on the stage, an unstable world. We know because the violence the dictator, which is Benjamin's word here, uses to maintain this position of this and necessarily to seat him. This jump to Vladimir Putin's use of language and imagery is a short one. The terminology in Critique of Violence is perhaps more familiar to this audience. Natural law, positive law, bourgeois capitalism, even Kant's essay Towards Eternal Peace. Though I warn you, Benjamin does return to the Bible. He begins by delimiting his subject, positive law's understanding of violence. Though he doesn't cite Thomas Hobbes, he might as well. Next slide, please. And in the violence of, if you look at this slide, you'll see the king's body is made up of people. About a third of the way through the 21-paragraph essay, Benjamin introduces the historical actor whom he says is justified in using violence, following Georges Sorel's Reflections on Violence. And Benjamin here, following George Sorel's idea of the general strike. General strike is important here because it is although we didn't think of a general strike of violence, it can be because it leads to the destruction of a company or possibly the society in itself. The mention of military force by Benjamin against strikers leads him to consider military violence in its usual form, wars between nations. Again, we are in an unstable situation, partially because, as many have argued, lacking the sovereign's power of unique access to violence, international law is actually no law at all. War, nevertheless, establishes legal norms, albeit often temporary ones. And in considering laws of war, Benjamin deals with the commandment, thou shalt not kill. In an audacious thought experiment, Benjamin imagines the commandment as an answer to one question. In this question being, may I kill? Which apparently comes to mind because of the many instances of divine violence, such as the story of Noah. Benjamin continues by noting the commandment is incomplete, for there is no penalty assessed for breaking it, which suggests that God has not foreseen the circumstances that might arise. For this reason, those who base the condemnation of every violent killing of a human being by a fellow human being on this commandment are wrong. He notes that Jewish law has allowed for violence in the sense of being self-defense since the beginning. I turn now to Benjamin's best-known work, a work of art in the age of its technical reproducibility, and his theses on the philosophy of history. At first, the first one, Art and Technical Reproductions, I'll refer to it, does not seem to offer us much. The destruction of the aura of the art, the annihilation of the distance between viewer and art because of photography, sound violence, but really aren't. Rather, where this sentence intersects with our concern is when he discusses the cult of the movie star, fostered by money and the film industry, which preserves not the unique aura of the person, but the spell of personality, the phony spell of the commodity. Written well after Benjamin turned to became a Marxist, albeit his own brand, and which had nothing with vulgar Marxists beholden to Moscow and Stalin's belief in rigid economic determinism, this sentence points directly at Lena Riefenstahl. Next slide, please. Hitler's favorite videographer. In fact, this essay was written in 1936, a year after Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will. Next slide, please. A video documenting the 1935 Nuremberg rally, which opens with Hitler's plane flying through the clouds to a monstrous reception when he lands. Riefenstahl misses no chance to overawe the viewer from arrayed soldiers. Next slide, please. Arrayed soldiers, huge Nazi flags, etc. We are manipulated, entranced with Hitler's personality, turned into a movie set itself. Put another way, the film erases the individuals at will and dissolves it into the scenes of uniformed Wehrmacht soldiers giving the Hitler salute, yelling Sieg Heil. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Today, we can see the same violent visual use on Russian TV. Day after day, using excellent production values and often images of tanks that appear to be on the verge of bursting onto the soundstage, where Vladimir Soloviev or Margarita Simonian, excuse my pronunciations, are calling for extermination of Ukraine. The production values overawe the viewers. Equally important are RUTV's shots of Russian President Vladimir Putin, which are usually larger than life and appear more often than not when one of the experts on the soundstage is praising his insight and foresight. All of this Benjamin foresaw when he wrote, "The logical result of fascism is the introduction of aesthetics into political life." Here, Benjamin does not use aesthetics in a Kantian sense, or what we might use when we're discussing the poetry of Taras Shevchenko. Rather, the aesthetics Benjamin means is the technical manipulation of the image of the great leader. Think of the towering posters of Stalin, Mao, or Kim Il-jung, or for that matter, Putin. The logical result of fascism, Benjamin writes, is the introduction of aesthetics into political life, as I just said. The violation of the masses, whom fascism with its Führer cult forces to their knees, has its counterpart in the violation of the apparatus, which is pressed into production values. These last words meaning something akin to the cult of personality that wraps around the fascist leader who uses old rituals to enhance his own power, close quote. Think here of Putin's embrace of Metropolitan Kirill and his embrace of Putin. We've lost the slides. Lest we doubt that this is intimately connected to violence, Benjamin writes in the very next sentence, all efforts to render politics aesthetics culminate in one thing, war. Since the publication of Benjamin's theses on the philosophy of history in 1950 and their publication in English in late 1960s, this short, go back once, previous slide. Yeah, stay there. Has become one of the most powerful in the Western canon. In the second thesis, Benjamin again employs religious language, speaking of the past as carrying a temple index by which is referred to redemption. Redemption should not be thought of only in its religious sense, despite the fact that the last two sentences he uses the phrase messianic power. For power, this power lies not in the supernatural God for Benjamin, but who intervenes in human affairs. Rather, Benjamin places this burden squarely on us. Quote, there's a secret agreement between the past generations and the present one. Our coming was expected on the earth. Like every generation that preceded it, we have been endowed with a weak messianic power, a power to which the past has a claim. That claim cannot be settled cheaply. But what past, we may ask? The good, the bad, the ugly? Well, yes, for Benjamin writes, nothing has ever happened that should be regarded lost for history. If Jesus said, let the buried bury their dead, Benjamin is saying, the dead have a claim. Perhaps better, they have a claim on us. For he writes in the fourth thesis, they have a retroactive force. They will constantly call into question every victory of past known rulers. What is he saying, rather elliptically here, is clarified a little later on. The true picture of the flash flits by. The past can be seized only as an image, which flashes up in an instant at a moment of danger. This means that the dream of historicists like Leopold Rank, who claimed to be able to articulate the past as it really was impossible. It not only was impossible and disingenuous, it is in fact dangerous. Let's pause for a moment and note how Benjamin's theses give a rather fair picture of what has happened in Ukraine since Russia's full-scale invasion. Think of how the past has been reclaimed by Ukrainians, taking down of Russian statues, this one of Lenin, renaming scores of Pushkin streets and squares is more than simply thumbing noses at at the Russians. This is not merely the emotion of the crowd. In the Ukrainian context, we are talking about Russia, which would consign the living to the half-light of Hades, designed by those who would erase the lived experience of tens of millions of destroyed bodies, were they to win, perish the thoughts. Pause for a moment and recall Benjamin's words about the loss of speech after the First World War. Historicism, we read in Thesis 4, sides with the victors because they get to write the history and what led to it, to be rather blunt. Now, this is an example of, in the States, the toppling of a statue of Robert E. Lee during the Black Lives Matter movement, which I originally was going to talk about, but can't, not enough time. Benjamin writes about historicism. All the victors are heirs to those who conquered before them. In fact, we're getting very close to hearing Benjamin from beyond the grave point to Putin, who he depicts himself as a latter-day Peter the Great. Empathy with the victor invariably benefits the rulers. Now, for without exception, the cultural treasures the historical materialist surveys have their origin in which he cannot contemplate with horror. We owe their existence. They owe their existence not only to the efforts of great minds and talents, but to the anonymous toil of contemporaries. We get a better idea of what Benjamin is saying by pausing a moment to hear Bertolt Brecht's, a few lines from Bertolt Brecht's poem, A Work of Questions History. Benjamin knew Brecht. Who built the 7 gates of Thebes? The books are filled with names of kings. Was it the king who hauled the craggy blocks of stone? Young Alexander conquered India, he alone. Caesar beat the Gauls. Was there not even a cook in his army? We've lost the slides again. Accordingly, Benjamin writes, there is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. And here I ask you to think for a moment about your smartphones. No, don't ask ChatGPT a question about them. Rather, make believe you're Superman. And what do you see? Next slide.
Nathan, sorry for interrupting you. We have
We're out of time.
We have to wrap up. Yep.
Okay.
It's fascinating. It's fascinating. We'd love to have you back.
Yeah.
But broadcast will stop in 20 minutes.
Okay.
And have, one more distinguished speaker from Ukraine, representing both Ukraine and Germany. So, would really...
Hello, everyone. I'm Elena Garoshka. Please, my presentation, yeah, it's possible to translate as a first slide. And I'm speaking today about the education in Ukraine, about transformation of social institute of education in Ukraine. And I would like to speak about conflict-sensitive model, the rise and development in order to save and to sustain education in my country. And the second slide, please. This is, I am trying to be short. It's a small citation prepared for me from Peter Gluckman. Ukraine is an extraordinary crisis of existential magnitude for its citizens, for its infrastructure, including both its physical human infrastructures, education and science. But it's a crisis that has existential implications, extended much more broadly. And the potential for the deep and lasting geostrategic division, which may not have been created to have significant impact, not only on our geopolitics, geostrategy, but it's also a global commons agenda concerning, of course, sustainability. And now we are speaking about the third slide, please, about two factors influencing the social institution of education in Ukraine. The first one is COVID pandemics, the 2-year COVID pandemics, and the second factor, this is the war. The next slide, please. The major impact of COVID on teaching and learning is the increase in online education. It's the hybrid mode of teaching, also blended learning has become the most popular form of learning. And of course, the main impact of COVID covers, first of all, access, international mobility, university mobility, disruption of research and extension of university activities, deepening digital divide, cutback of university operations, and transition from higher education to work and many other social practices instead of education. In addition, much research indicates that for many countries, the data obtained in the subject area unstable and dependent from national and cultural factors also. We have conducted prolonged investigation research between 3 countries, Ukraine, Turkey, and Spain, concerning the impact of COVID in education. And it's a very interesting picture. But in Ukraine, the main problems arising in pandemic times covered, first of all, quality of education, access to education resources and internet connection, lack of skills in computer use area, especially concerning teachers in school, security and health protection of teachers and learners, vaccination problems, and so to say, please, the next slide. But concerning higher education, we can speak about the prevalence of distance and hybrid formats of learning, also the moving from traditional pedagogic and andragogic models to heterogogy and cybergogy approaches, which was fixed. Which were fixed. This also, we can speak about learner engagement, innovative approaches, like, for example, GPT use chat in education, and effective format of education, formative assessment, coherence, consistency, and transparency. It's like so contain the main priorities in the educational community in COVID times. But now, after COVID, just after COVID, then war started. And since February 2022, please the next slide, many Ukrainian students have not been able to return to traditional education in schools and universities, and thus, for example, data, it's rather fresh, data January 2023, it's nearly 13,000 general secondary education institutions. Only, you say to say, 4,000 had full-time students, while the rest were either studying online, more than 4,000, or in a hybrid blended form. It's also about 4,500. And you see it, however, even in relatively safe regions, for example, Lviv regions or Chernovtsi region, in-person or blended learning is constantly interrupted by ER raids, power shutdowns, and other things. Next slide, please. According, you see it, to the Office of the United Nations Commission, High Commission of Refugees, it's very interesting data, and it contradicted a little data yesterday showed by Evgeny Ivanovich Golovankha, but concerning EU data countries, so to say, Ukrainians who cross the border with European Union was then 17.7 million persons. And you see it according to the Office of the Prosecutor General, you see that 453 children have been killed and 918 being injured through the war. And this data don't include complete information on various areas where hostilities now taking place. Please, next slide. And you see it also the impact of war, 800,000 students, 20% of the total have changed the form of education from full-time to distance and family education and other formats. Now it's very interesting. I am observing such picture in Germany. It's bilateral education. Our children, so to say, go to German school, and then after German schools offline, it's Ukrainian schools online. And you see that about 30% of students don't have regular access to the educational process during the war at all. And only 40% of parents said that their children were studied regularly. And you see that 500,000 students and 12,500 school teachers continue to stay abroad, as for me, for example, now. And you see it that 2,631 general secondary education institution out of school and specialized education institution were damaged, and 420 were destroyed. It's according to the Committee of Education of our Supreme Council of Ukraine. It's Telegram channel by Irina Tisha. And you see the damage caused by the war to education infrastructure. It's the next slide, please. You see it, $9.9 billion. Education institutions continue to suffer damage and destruction due to the war, and the total number of damaged and destroyed educational facilities reached 3,200, including more than 1,500 secondary schools and 538 higher education institutions. And you see this is data for April 2023. And the Ministry of Education and Science of Ukraine has created even a special website, please. Next slide. Next slide, do please. One more, okay. Interactive map of destruction, and this map provides data on the losses to educational institutions as a result of the Russian invasion. It's interactive online card, but I would like to specify that the damage is mounting faster than the website's moderators have time to update the information on the map. And even this incomplete statistic show how badly the educational infrastructure of Ukraine has suffered. Next slide, please. And you see it, how this map looks like. And you see it, it's interesting that currently there are no data from Chernihiv, Kharkiv, and Lugansk regions. Yeah, and you see it, it's like example. Next slide, please. This is a ruined, for example, building of Karazin Business School of Vasil Karazin National University, which my own daughter graduated in December 2021. And now you see it's the result of this barbaric bombardment. And please, next slide. It's also the portrait of my colleague in Nazava agency. It's a professor from Uzhgorod State University, Fedor Shandar, you so to say, teaching from the trench. It's like symbol of our education in wartime. And please, the next slide. And you see it, this data concerning schools and formats of education. You see it, data concerning a format of education. You see it, there are nearly about 4 schools now in Ukraine in face-to-face format. Distant format, it's 4004, and in blended format, offline and online, it's 4006. And you see it, 9,099 schools provide education services for internally displaced education seekers. It's accepting 156,638 students. And you see it also, this link to this data. And please, the next slide. And you see it, naturally new concepts, so to say, are needed to describe this negative phenomena. It's very new for our, of course, for our society, and it's also, it requires new reflection, new terminology, and of course, urgent research. And you see it, such terminology already have appeared, like educational losses, learning losses, educational gaps, learning gaps, etc. And now I would like to introduce the term learning divide. It's also like gender divide or digital divide concerning the gaps in the access to education, access to offline education, and it's combining, so to say, digital divide and many, including digital divide and many other interesting indicators. However, their use is sometimes concerning this terminology, I mean, unsystematic and non-terminological, which naturally didn't contribute to the proper communication of a truly complex problem and the search for ways to solve it effectively. And you see it, it's, please, the next slide. I have collected these terms already. It's learning loss, school loss, gap in performance, unfinished learning, and with definition of 2 basic terms in the subject area, like learning loss, it's any loss of knowledge, skills, abilities, or solving interruption of academic progress due to pauses in the learning of particular student. It's also learning gaps are significant and persistent differences in academic, you see it, performance between different groups of students. Please, the next slide. And you see it also, the description of a main term concerning educational losses. We can speak about learning losses, already described for me, educational losses, and show slowing down the pace of personal development, of this critically important of social skills, etc., 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 especially concerning 2 years of COVID, and it's 1 year and a half of wartime in Ukraine. Please, the next slide. I have known that I'm very restricted in time consequences. We see it, long breaks in education, according to the recent views of researchers, affect both the development of the individual and the development of society as a whole. At the individual level, we can speak about educational losses, primarily means the loss of the opportunity of a comprehensive development and unlocking potential. Students have few opportunities to develop the skills necessary for adult life and therefore have very worse chances of becoming successful citizens in the future. And also, please, the next slide. Concerning consequences, speaking about the consequences of education losses for society, experts primarily focus on the economic aspect of the problem. It's of primary importance. Its long breaks in education affect both the development of the individual and the development of society. And it's a very stressful situation. Please, the next slide. You see it, and consequences. I would like to differentiate this a number of problems affecting the learning outcomes, also to say, provided these consequences of in Ukrainian educational system during the war. And you see it as there are 6, so to say, the biggest problems, so to say. The first one, living in the temporary occupied territories, residence in the area of active hostilities, change of place of residence, destruction of educational institutions, error rates and power blackout outages, and so to say. Please, next slide. You see it also, it's not yet possible to determine how each of these factors affects the quality of education and what educational losses it will cause. However, some analogies, albeit relative, of course, can be found in the history of education concerning the experiences of Vietnam, of China, and many others. We can speak about, so to say, economical concerning, so to say, not only economical, but also all researchers agree that governments and war-affected countries should focus on establishing comprehensive support for children in war, including providing them with necessary resources and infrastructure, building psychological support system. Please, the next slide. And you see it, this requires all this in order to provide a rising, so to say, we can speak now about the rising of conflict-sensitive model of education in Ukraine. It's of high priority. The first and most crucial step in implementing conflict-sensitive model of education is to understand the context in which educational activities are taking place. And this requires a full analysis of the context, taking into account its multidimensionality and diverse influences, from military confrontation to social political fractures in society, and from the immediate consequences, destruction and possibility of education, to indirect effect, deterioration of access to education for certain social groups in conflict in affected areas, such as learners with special educational needs, learners from the temporary, so to say, occupied territories, and so to say. And you see it, the following measures can be considered as potentially overcoming educational losses in Ukraine. Is concerning like the pivotal steps of this model of conflict-sensitive education, repetition, studying during holidays, tutoring of public expense, creation of integration classes. And now I'm observing a very interesting phenomenon in Germany for our Ukrainian school children, special integrative classes conducted in also, to say, to facilitate the integration of Ukrainian school children into the German system of education. And you see this revision and adaptation of educational programs focusing on topics that need to be and areas requiring catching up, methodological training of teachers to work with students with such pace of learning. And of course, you see it, please, next slide. It's about, next slide, yes. You see it also.
I'm awfully sorry. We have like 30 seconds and we'll be
yes,
cut.
Yes,
cut
please,
off.
the next time you see it proposes. Next slide, please. Yes, yes, I follow the time, and you see it strengthening school autonomy and teacher interaction and cooperation. Please, the next one. And you see the 4 methods of conflict management in schools, in learning. It's curriculum infusion, mediation programs, classroom strategies, comprehensive approach. And you see it, the next slide, the development of the conflict. You see it, and next slide, please. You see it of what is conflict-sensitive education in the context of war. It's a concept of realizing the right to education and meeting other educational needs of people in times of crisis and instability. And in conflict-affected societies, education plays a crucial role as a source of information on skills for survivals, medical care, and this is institute must consolidate our society. And you see, thank you for, I finished. Thank you very much for your attention.
Professor Goroshko, thanks a lot for your presentation. This is a beautiful and extremely forward-looking conclusion of our general session. Thanks for your keynote speech. We are really honored and pleased to have had you, and we are looking to continuing our cooperation. I'm extremely grateful to all speakers for your wonderful presentations, for your ideas, for those who are from Ukraine, for your heroism, and for our friends from overseas, for your solidarity and for standing with Ukraine. Just one thing, I'll switch to Ukrainian. Шановні друзі, ще в нас півхвилини є. В контексті роботи нашої конференції хотів також поінформувати, що ми цього року започаткували нову магістерську програму, науковий магістр, 2 роки, приймаємо бакалаврів і приймаємо магістрів вже готових під назвою освітня програма «Аналітика соціальних даних». З ініціативи нашого ректора, академіка Згоровського, ця програма започаткована з його особистою участю, а він титан дійсно академічної дослідницької думки і державної політики. Тобто буде дуже унікальна комбінація соціології із математикою, з великими даними, штучним інтелектом, осінт, елементами програмування. Тобто для тих, хто не хоче бути суто програмістом або суто дата-аналітиком, але хоче свій інтелект, свої пізнання даних математичних, комп'ютерних застосовувати до аналізу покращення, модернізації суспільства, то просимо, набір вже відкритий. І дуже дякую. Сьогоднішня конференція просто ще один не цеглина, а великий будівельний блок в ту будівлю, яку ми вибудовуємо, українського суспільства, українських соціальних наук, української соціології, зокрема. І ще раз, пані Олена, дякую за таку презентацію, яка ідеально вписується в нашу програму «Світогляд», тобто чудовий висновок, над яким ми будемо і надалі працювати. Дякую і змушені поставити...
Все буде добре, сподіваюся.
Дякую. Ставимо тут 3 крапки і до нових зустрічей. На все добре. Всього найкращого. Всім безпечного дня і всім нам перемоги.